Fry and Leela are easily one of my favorite fictional couples, despite a long and complicated history of starts, stops, cancellations, and renewals. This compilation contains a bunch of Fry and Leela-centric videos that I've made over the years. However, a lot of these were made before the show was renewed at Hulu, so expect me to refer to the show as being over and to speak about a lot of these stories with a sense of finality before we get into the Hulu era stuff. I mean, who would have thought it was going to come back for a fourth time or whatever? Okay, enjoy. I can't speak for all Futurama fans, but I know that for me, the most important through line in the series was Fry and Leela's relationship. That, of course, wasn't the only thing that made the series great, but it was an ongoing story that I was very invested in, and I think a large portion of the fanbase felt the same way. But I think what made this through line so engaging, and what made it work for the audience, was how gradually and naturally they eased into it. The seeds for their connection were planted from the very first episode, but the idea of them really being a potential couple wasn't super explored until the show really got moving. And while I did start to feel like the will they won't they nature of Fry and Leela started to spin its wheels a little bit in the later seasons, you cannot deny that they absolutely stuck their landing. So join me as I break down the Fry and Leela relationship development chronologically, talk about what worked, what didn't work, and why I think the story of Fry and Leela's relationship is the heart of Futurama. The story of Fry and Leela literally spans the entirety of Futurama, and while it has its ups and downs, I think overall it's an incredibly satisfying journey, and it was particularly rewarding after watching the series for 13 years. Obviously there were no real hints of romance in the pilot, but this episode did establish one incredibly important thing. Fry and Leela both experienced a very specific type of loneliness living in the year 3000. Fry having left his loved ones in the past, and Leela being an orphan with completely unknown origins.
I know how it feels to be alone.
The way they were able to relate in this moment actually led to the entirety of their friendship and future career together at Planet Express. The next real meaningful development isn't until A Flight to Remember aboard the Titanic. There's a pretty fun Three's Company storyline throughout where Fry has to pretend to be both Amy and Leela's significant other.
Come and knock on our door. Na 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 na.
But we actually do get a little hint of romance between Fry and Leela later in the episode. Leela shows a hint of jealousy when she thinks Fry and Amy are actually dating, and as they look off into a beautiful heart-shaped nebula, the two nearly share a kiss. This is played off as a one-time situational thing, but it's established that they have a connection, and at least some sort of attraction to each other. There's a really similar moment in Xmas Story where Fry and Leela nearly kiss when Robot Santa is about to blow them to smithereens, but I think the rest of Fry and Leela's connection in this episode really gets overshadowed, which is understandable since Futurama's take on Christmas is so memorable, with John Goodman playing Robot Santa and trying to kill everyone. But the Fry and Leela stuff is the highlight for me. Fry laments the fact that he has no family to share the holiday with, and very selfishly ignores that the same thing is true for Leela.
Here I am whining like a pig, while all along Leela was as lonely as a frog.
Fry goes out to get Leela a gift and ends up nearly falling to his death. Leela ends up saving him, and they have one of my favorite moments the two share in the entire series.
It's okay. You're lonely and I'm lonely, but together, we're lonely together.
To me, this is more meaningful than the near kiss, and it really represents their growing connection. After this, we get a bit more development in the form of subtle jealousy. Episodes like Put Your Head on My Shoulder and The Deep South show Leela being a bit jealous of Fry's other relationships, and A Bicyclops Built for Two does the same for Fry. But the real meat and potatoes comes in Parasites Lost, one of my absolute favorite episodes in the series. Fry eats a truck stop egg salad sandwich, giving him parasitic worms that actually end up improving nearly every aspect of his body and mind. These newfound improvements actually cause Leela to fall for him, and even leads her to stop the crew from eliminating the worms from Fry's system. Fry continues to woo Leela, learning how to play the holophoner and performing for her, but when she says this,
Oh, Fry, I love what you've become.
he decides to eliminate the worms from his own system, out of fear that Leela only likes him for what the worms bring to the table, not for himself. And of course, without the worms' help, he blows it pretty quickly. While I understand Fry's concern about the worms, I do think that ultimately Leela was falling for Fry. The parasites more or less showed off Fry's full potential. They didn't necessarily bring anything new to the table. And no, Fry might not ever reach the level that the parasites lifted him to, but I think that this clip said it best.
But it's only recently that I've been able to articulate my thoughts.
These were things that were in Fry all along, that he only now understood how to convey. And this idea is one that would really be the crux of the will they won't they nature of Fry and Leela's relationship. The episode The Cyberhouse Rules once again showed off Fry's love for Leela as she receives a fake second eye to look more quote-unquote normal, and starts to date her childhood crush Adelaide Atkins. All the while, Fry asserts that she was great the way she was. Ultimately, this was a small blip in the evolution of their relationship, but in the end, Leela did thank Fry for being a true friend. The real significant follow-up to Parasites Lost came in Time Keeps on Slipping, where the idea of Fry's potential in terms of a possible relationship with Leela is spelled out pretty plainly. It's clear that Leela has an attraction to Fry, but it's also clear that some of his shortcomings are holding her back.
The thing is, Fry is very sweet, but he's so immature. I love his boyish charm, but I hate his childishness.
Like I said, this is sort of the main question when it comes to Fry and Leela's potential relationship, and it's explored throughout the series. In Time Keeps on Slippin', the collection of chronotons causes temporal anomalies in which time continues to jump forward at random variables. This episode showcases Fry trying to impress Leela over and over, seemingly taking the wrong lesson from Parasites Lost. Fry seemed convinced that it was the things he could do thanks to the parasites, not the fact that he himself had shown maturity and growth. Fry's attempts to impress Leela had nothing to do with self-improvement. They were simply a ploy to try and attract Leela.
I learned how to work the gravity pump too, in case we need to move more stars. So are we dating now?
We learned that during a time skip, Fry and Leela actually get married, but because time skipped, neither of them can remember what caused Leela's change of heart. And then of course, when time skips again, we see that they've already gotten divorced. The end of the episode leaves Fry devastated and wondering what it could have possibly been that he did to get Leela to marry him. Leela even feels pretty bad about this and lets Fry pilot the ship as they detonate a doomsday device to help eliminate the time skips. This, sadly, would be the exact reason that Leela would never learn what Fry had done to win her over. As he flies the ship to a safe distance for detonation, Fry learns exactly what he'd done.
I moved the stars themselves to write her a love note in the sky.
Unfortunately, it's immediately destroyed by the detonation, and Leela never learns about Fry's message in the sky. For the remainder of the Fox era of Futurama, Fry is pretty hopelessly devoted to Leela. In Love and Rocket, he nearly sacrifices his own life to save hers. He goes to great lengths to help uncover the secret behind her origins in Leela's homeworld. He even goes on a cute teenage date with her when they're both de-aged in Teenage Mutant Leela's Hurdles. The real next significant episode in their development, though, is The Why of Fry. We see Fry's continued attempts to get Leela to go out with him, only for her to reveal that she's got a date that night. And not just any date. A date with
the mayor's aide.
Rushing through the brain spawn plot a bit, this episode basically gives Fry the opportunity to go back in time and stop Nibbler from pushing him into the freezer tube. But in the context of Fry and Leela's relationship, this is a really great moment. Fry basically refuses to change his past just for the chance to possibly be with Leela, showing that his devotion and care for her outweighs some of his own trauma. And over the course of her date, Leela realizes that so-called important people with impressive titles don't actually make them impressive people. The episode ends on a really sweet moment. Leela tells Fry she doesn't care that he isn't the most important person in the universe.
It really makes me happy to see you right now.
Then I am the most important person in the universe.
What a good ending. And we, of course, know that Fry is the most important person in the universe. The last stretch of episodes in the Fox era actually put a pretty significant focus on Fry and Leela, and do so in some of the series' best episodes. The Sting, in particular, is an absolute masterpiece of storytelling. When Fry is impaled and apparently killed by a space bee, Leela's mental state completely unravels in grief. She starts to struggle distinguishing dreams from reality and believes that Fry must be alive, communicating to her through those dreams. I think Leela's own realization about how much she cared about Fry surprised even her, and it completely consumes her. The episode ultimately reveals that Leela actually was the one who took on the poison from the Sting, and that Fry hadn't left Leela's side while she was comatose in the hospital. In fact, all of the things that Leela thought were Fry communicating to her actually were. He was talking to her throughout the coma. This episode is great for so many reasons, but it really highlights how deeply both Fry and Leela cared for each other. And even though Leela wasn't quite ready to admit how much her feelings for Fry meant, it gave the audience a pretty great understanding of her subconscious love for him. The Farnsworth Paradox came next and explored Fry and Leela in a whole new way, by holding an alternate mirror up to them and showing them a life that could have been. When the Planet Express crew is pulled into an alternate universe where the primary difference is that the results of coin flips are opposite, Fry and Leela are faced with alternate versions of themselves that are actually married. It basically explains that at some point Leela flipped a coin to decide whether or not to go out with Fry. In our universe, it was tails, but in this one, it was heads. Alternate Fry and Leela had an amazing evening together, and eventually, Fry proposed with a diamond scrunchie.
1 year later, I got beat up at a Neil Diamond concert by a guy named Scrunchy.
This is a pretty minor aspect of the episode, but it is pretty telling. We as the audience, at this point, sort of know and feel that Fry and Leela are meant for each other. But the holdout is Leela. This confirms our suspicions straight to Leela's face.
There, but for the flip of a coin go we.
And the final episode of the Fox era rightfully puts the focus squarely on Fry and Leela's relationship, making good on 4 seasons of development and basically directly following up Parasites Lost. The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings is a masterpiece that shows Fry make a deal with the robot devil so that he can play the holophoner for Leela. In a twist of fate, he swaps hands with the robot devil himself and proceeds to write an incredible opera all about and dedicated to Leela and her life story. Through Through some devilish shenanigans, the robot devil basically tricks Leela into signing a contract to give him her hand in marriage. Fry is forced to either return the devil's hands, eliminating his ability to play beautiful music to win Leela over, or Leela will be doomed to a life in robot hell. This was originally the series finale of Futurama, and it ends nearly perfectly. Fry, of course, gives up his hands to save Leela, and Leela asks Fry to keep playing, despite the loss of his skills.
I want to hear how it ends.
Fry performs a really pretty little composition that shows Fry and Leela kiss and walk off into the distance together, implying that one day, Fry and Leela would be together. A lovely ending. But of course, the series returned for what I refer to as the second era, the straight-to-DVD movies, and 2 of these stories put a major focus on Fry and Leela's relationship in big ways. Basically, in Bender's Big Score, now about 4 years after the events of The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, Leela starts to date a man named Lars Fillmore. The end of the film reveals a fun twist that Lars is actually a time paradox duplicate of Fry created by Fry's actions in the film. All of Lars' experiences and memories are the same as Fry's until their story splits, after which Lars lives for 12 years in the past from 2000 to 2012, and then another 5 in the future from 3002 to 3007, before he meets Leela again. Basically, the twist that Lars is an older, more mature version of Fry ties into exactly what the first 4 seasons of the show established beautifully. Leela has an inherent attraction to Fry, but she's held back by some of his immature and childish behavior. In the 17 years that Lars lived without Leela, he really evolved into exactly the type of person Leela wants to be with. Lars, as a time paradox duplicate, was unfortunately doomed, and so their relationship wasn't meant to be. However, Lars' intervention in Fry's life actually helped propel his own development forward, and helped Fry grow and mature more quickly than even Lars had. The end of Bender's Big Score leaves us on a really sweet note, as Fry consoles Leela for her loss of Lars, and we're once again teased with a potential future for the pair.
He was a good man, Leela.
Yeah, you were.
After Bender's Big Score, we don't really get much of a focus on Fry and Leela until Into the Wild Green Yonder. We do see a little bit of jealousy from Leela in The Beast with a Billion Backs when Fry starts dating Colleen, but honestly that storyline was more focused on the polyamorous nature of their relationship, which would tie into the Yivo storyline later. Into the Wild Green Yonder is the one that brings us back to the Fry and Leela of it all, though not strictly in a relationship context. I think one of the strongest aspects of this last movie is that it focuses more on Fry and Leela's perception of one another as people, rather than prospective lovers. I've had to try and give a concise breakdown of this entire movie in 2 other videos, and honestly, it's pretty tough, but the important thing is that in the end, when all logic says otherwise, Leela trusts and believes in Fry as a person to do the right thing.
You're you. That's all I need to know.
It isn't strictly about their viability as a couple or about their will they won't they relationship, it's about how well they know each other as human beings. The final sequence of the movie does, however, bring it back to a bit of a relationship context, as the crew thinks this might be the end for them. Fry expresses his love for Leela.
I love you, Leela.
Maybe I waited too long to say this, but I love you too.
Leela reciprocates, and the 2 of them kiss before they fly into the wormhole, for what, at the time, could have been the last ever episode of Futurama. Again. But as we know, the wormhole propelled the series forward into the 3rd era, what I call the revival seasons, or the Comedy Central years. And admittedly, this is where I feel like the nature of their relationship maybe started to spin its wheels a bit. The first episode back, Rebirth, gives us a pretty interesting sci-fi premise that directly follows up where Fry and Leela left off in Into the Wild Green Yonder. Following their trip through the wormhole, the Planet Express ship and Nimbus crash, killing everyone on board except the Professor and apparently Fry. The Professor is able to resurrect everyone except Leela, leading Fry to be stricken with unimaginable grief. He even builds a robot replacement to try and ease the pain. Hermes then transmits a profile of Leela's personality into the robot, basically creating a perfect recreation for Fry. This gets further out of hand when Leela actually wakes up, causing robot Leela to get jealous and try to take out the real Leela. Dang, a lot happens in this one. And it's not even over, because then we learn that Leela actually had survived the crash, and that the Fry we've been following the entire episode was actually a robot duplicate that she made in her grief, that had subsequently killed her due to being stuffed with too much copper wiring. Alright, so this episode took a real long walk to get there, but I do think that in the end, it's got some pretty great insight into Fry and Leela's relationship. Namely, that neither of them could go on without the other one. They literally both at this point in their friendship would rather create a non-living version of the other to be with, rather than go on without them. Which is why the end of this episode, while really sweet, doesn't quite make sense to me.
Well, you know how I feel. I waited for you for 1,000 years. I can wait a little longer.
While I really do love this line, and I think it shows a lot of emotional maturity in Fry, I think it doesn't quite line up with everything we just saw. We know that both of these characters cannot live without the other one, so why do they keep waiting? I think from a writing perspective, the staff wasn't quite ready to have a significant status quo shift for the beginning of the revival seasons. It's a totally understandable fear. The show is coming back to TV for the first time in years, and they wanted it to still feel like the same show. Jumping directly into it with an immediate change in the nature of Fry and Leela's relationship would have been pretty major. So while I do feel like this is when the Fry and Leela will they won't they thing started to outlive its welcome a bit, I still understand it from a writing standpoint. They wanted a little more room to ease the characters into the relationship, and fortunately this did lead to some of the best episodes of the series, even if I think there were some missteps. Over the course of the first set of revival episodes, they slowly hinted that Fry and Leela had been getting closer and exploring the idea of being together without outright saying it. Leela even outright agrees to some of Fry's clumsier advances, which obviously would not have been the case before.
Leela, wanna join the Mile Deep Club?
Sure, why not?
But they also seemed intent on holding on to some of the character traits the characters had before it was suggested that the two might be together. Episodes like Inagata to Leela show Leela hooking up with Zap again, albeit in a very contrived scenario, and ditto for Fry, who very quickly agreed to end-of-the-world sex with Amy. But the episode The Late Philip J. Fry gave us a truly memorable Fry and Leela-centric story that sort of made it all feel worth it, as it's easily one of the best the series has to offer. Fry is late to Leela's birthday lunch and promises to make it up to her that night with a dinner at Cavern on the Green. But unfortunately, he's accidentally launched forward in time with Bender and the Professor in a forward-traveling time machine. The episode shows two parallel stories, the time-traveling trio hoping to find backwards time travel technology, and the events of the timeline from Leela's perspective after Fry, Bender, and the Professor were assumed dead. Eventually, Leela learns the truth of what happened to Fry, and deeply regrets the pain and anger she held on to her entire life. She goes to Cavern on the Green, where she was supposed to have dinner with Fry, and laser blasts the ceiling. Cut to the year 1 billion, where Fry, the Professor, and Bender are trapped, and Fry discovers Leela's message preserved in the Cavern on the Green.
Dear Fry, our time together was short, but it was the best time of my life.
This version of Leela lived an entire lifetime filled with success, but the most important time to her was the time she spent with Fry. Fortunately, the trio actually learned that time is cyclical, and the entire universe begins anew the further forward they go. They're actually able to move forward in time back to the exact point that they left and resume their lives. Now, many have been frustrated to point out that this technically means that the Leela we followed throughout the show up to this point actually never got to be with Fry, and lived with that pain and regret for her entire life. And yeah, I understand why this might bother people, but in the end, I think it makes for a really special episode that also ends on one of my favorite Fry and Leela moments.
What I'll remember is our time together.
The remainder of the 6th production season sort of continues this on-again, off-again style of relationship for Fry and Leela. Episodes like That Darn Cats have Leela say she has no man, then Prisoner of Benda shows Fry and Leela hook up again, albeit in Zoidberg and the Professor's bodies. Fry messes up majorly in The Mutants Are Revolting, revealing that Leela is a mutant to the public, and even jumps into the mutating sewer lake to prove his devotion to her, until it's revealed that he was never mutated, of course. Status quo stuff. His fight for her affection seems to still be an ongoing struggle. Leela is more interested in another man in the episode Fry and the Eggman, and it all sort of comes to a head in the 3rd potential series finale, Overclockwise. When Planet Express nearly goes out of business again, Leela decides it's time to leave and move on. She openly talks about the issues I've mentioned here in regards to her relationship with Fry.
I don't know. I guess I'm just feeling uneasy about us being so on again, off again.
Leela leaves and Fry is devastated. But in the end of the episode, Leela returns because she misses Fry, in what I think is the final turning point for Fry and Leela. Through his overclocked godlike abilities, Bender learns exactly what the future holds for Fry and Leela, and the two of them read it together. We don't learn exactly what's in it, but we can infer through their reactions that in the end, it's really good. This was nearly the final episode of the series, again, and I think fans would have been okay with this ending had there never been another episode. This 6th production season, in my opinion, struggled with what it wanted to do with Fry and Leela. It was afraid to abandon the status quo, but seemingly equally afraid to eliminate the Fry and Leela development entirely. It led to some truly great episodes, but also led to some seemingly inconsistent characterizations across the 26 episodes. I think a lot of fans took issue with this, and would have rather the show leaned all in one way or the other, and I think the writers took note for the final production season. The final 26 episodes basically show Fry and Leela in an ongoing relationship. There are a few instances of the inconsistencies creeping back in,
but for the most part, they shifted the status quo and leaned into it, which was welcomed for a lot of the fans. A Farewell to Arms is the first that really showcases the status quo change, as Fry and Leela are seemingly in a relationship the entire time. This episode focuses on an ancient prophecy revealing that the Earth will soon be apocalyptically doomed. They have to decide which Earthicans will take an ancient spaceship to Mars to avoid certain doom. Fry actually gives up his spot on the ship to save Leela. He's willing to sacrifice himself to save the woman he loves. Of course, it turns out that the prophecy was actually about Mars, leading to a bonkers sequence where Mars scrapes by Earth while flying through space. I really love the end of the episode. The crew is able to jump back to Earth from Mars, except for Leela, who is on crutches and can't make the jump. Fry climbs atop the Planet Express building and reaches out for Leela, trying to save her again, which leads to both of their arms being ripped from their sockets.
You were willing to sacrifice yourself so I could live. You failed, miserably, but you're the only person who loves me enough to try.
Their arms were doomed to float through space hand in hand forever. A nice little metaphor for their actual relationship. The next episode to really focus on their relationship is Fun on a Bun, which is a weird one. Fry embarrasses Leela so thoroughly while drunk at Oktoberfest that she breaks up with him, shortly before Fry seemingly dies in a sausage-making incident. It's just weird to say. This show also really likes to make these two think that the other has died. It's kind of brutal. Fry, of course, didn't die, but finds himself memoryless in a prehistoric society of cave people under ice. In her grief, Leela basically eternal sunshines herself, eliminating all of her memories of Fry. Despite the fact that both of them cannot remember one another, their subconscious seems to nag at the back of their minds, trying to remind each other of one another. This all comes to a head in a weird battle between Oktoberfest and the Under Ice Cave People Society, where Fry and Leela fight each other one-on-one. The two suddenly remember one another and begin to make out, once more showcasing that these two were meant for each other. Damn, this really was a weird one, but it's a sweet ending at least. The most overt exploration of the relationship comes in Fry and Leela's Big Fling, which is specifically about Fry and Leela trying to secretly spend an evening together, unbeknownst to their co-workers. It's not super clear why it's a secret from the rest of the crew, but it was nice to actually get an episode that is specifically and openly about Fry and Leela's actual ongoing relationship as a confirmed couple. The episode basically showcases their struggle to find alone time away from their co-workers, which leads them on a romantic getaway where they run into Leela's ex, Sean. It's not an incredible episode or anything, but it's kind of nice to just see Fry and Leela deal with actual relationship issues, and not issues focused on the status of their relationship. I sort of wish we had seen a bit more of it overall. But like I said, the final 26 episodes didn't really try to deny that Fry and Leela were in a relationship, or have its cake and eat it too with the on-again, off-again tendencies. It wasn't always a focus throughout the season, but nothing really contradicted it either, which I think went a long way with fans. But it also sort of made sense given the events of Overclockwise. If the two of them learned about the future of their relationship in that final scene, it would make sense that they would just embrace it for the rest of the series. And of course, the entire thing comes to a close in the incredible and final series finale, Meanwhile, which once again tricks Fry into momentarily believing that Leela was dead. What a weird thing for the show to do over and over again. And this isn't even the last time it does it in this episode. This event leads Fry to decide it's time to propose to Leela, knowing he can't live without her. Using this button that sends him back in time 10 seconds, he gets her a really nice ring and proposes, asking her to meet him at the Empire State Building at sunset if she accepts the proposal. When she doesn't arrive on time, Fry jumps off the building, not wanting to live without her, only to realize his watch was wrong because of the time-traveling button. Leela watches as Fry is about to plummet to his death, which he continually resets with the button. Again, really weird that they keep putting these characters through this kind of trauma. I might have to count how many times this happens in the series, because it's a lot. The Planet Express crew manages to save Fry, but he breaks the button and freezes the entire universe in place. But this really is just an excellent ending for Fry and Leela's relationship. They get married, they travel the frozen world, and they grow old together. It's just a pure, sweet ending to the years and years of development that this relationship went through. And I cannot say enough about how gratifying it was after following the show for 13 years. The two end up back at the Vampire State Building, and miraculously, the professor finds them through this wormhole thing. They're able to fix the frozen universe, but would have to go back to before everything froze and wouldn't remember everything they've experienced in this episode. But they decide that together, it's worth it.
What do you say? Want to go around again?
I do.
Ultimately, despite maybe the missteps in the 6th production season, this relationship was so incredibly well developed. For the most part, it felt like a perfectly natural progression with clear obstacles meant to be worked out by the couple, and the working out of those obstacles was always done in a subversive but satisfying way. I loved that they first showed that the two not only just had a strong connection, but a connection through their own brands of loneliness. It was specific. Two people that had to find their own family and had gone through difficulty and trauma all their own. I loved the way that seeking Leela's love motivated Fry to grow grow and improve as a person. It was mostly really well handled, and the fact that their connection was teased in the very first episode, only to be fully paid off in the series finale, made the entire thing seriously rewarding. This relationship is the heart of the series, and I think the writers understood that, seeing as how each of the series' 4 potential finales always ended with a focus on their relationship and connection. Okay, so before we go, I had to do this. I tallied it up, and unless I'm missing some, there are 13 episodes where Fry or Leela think that the other has died, and in some of them it happens multiple times. I don't want to clutter up the end of this video, but maybe I'll post a list in the comments. In the end, not only was the journey of Fry and Leela satisfying, but the legacy they left in their wake is pretty significant. They got married twice, 3 times if you count Lars. Their love survived multiple deaths. It spans across alternate universes. It communicated through comas. It survived multiple deals with the devil. Tons of time travel. Fry moved the stars for Leela. Their arms are literally floating through space, hand in hand for the rest of time. They froze the entire universe with their love. And after they grew old together, they said, let's do it again. Here's to Fry and Leela.
Fry and Leela have always been the emotional center of Futurama. In fact, the series finale, meanwhile, was completely focused on the two of them tying the knot, finally solidifying their relationship. But though the series finale is the ultimate testament to their love, it all takes place within a frozen universe, and we don't get to see Fry and Leela actually live out a real life together, just this beautiful fantasy of a frozen world. This also means we didn't get to see whether or not children were in the Fry/Leela family future. But what if I told you that we almost did get to see this in the show? In a DVD commentary, writers David X. Cohen and Josh Weinstein revealed an unused episode concept that would have featured Fry and Leela's future son. But how did this play out, and why did they ultimately abandon the storyline? Well, I'll tell you exactly why and throw in a bit of my own hopes and speculation along the way. Just don't tell Fry about it.
I tried to fix it once, but then I got mad and hit it some more. I guess it's good we didn't have children.
So the origin of the unused story of Fry and Leela's son surrounds the episode Law and Oracle, which was actually a Minority Report homage. In the DVD commentary, David X. Cohen and Josh Weinstein reveal that they had worked for 3 full days breaking a different story about a backwards time traveler. The story still revolved around predicting future events, like Law and Oracle, but this version involved a character who not only traveled backwards in time, but moved and spoke backwards as well, making them impossible to understand. And the big reveal? That this character would turn out to be Fry and Leela's son from the future. But why didn't they move forward with this backwards moving idea? Well, at the Futurama series finale panel hosted by Nerdist, David X. Cohen revealed a little more information.
We worked on it for like 3 days, and it was the coolest science fiction story. But there was nothing funny about it whatsoever. And,
So while we were denied this major reveal of Fry and Leela's future, it was for a fair reason. Futurama is primarily a comedy show, so it's understandable that the writers felt cautious about such a complicated sci-fi idea eating up the entire runtime without allowing for much comedy. Interestingly though, one aspect of this story did end up being used in the Futurama series finale itself.
the forward-moving in time people met the backwards-moving in time person, and time froze, and they were finally able to interact. So we took that idea and used it in the finale.
So while Meanwhile used the idea of time freezing as a means to further Fry and Leela's relationship, this unused story would have used it as a huge climactic moment where Fry and Leela got to meet their backwards time-traveling son. And based on the fact that this episode idea and the subsequent one, Law and Oracle, were about predicting future events, I think it's safe to say that Fry and Leela's son was attempting to tell Fry and Leela something very important about their future. Now, while I totally understand their reluctance to tell this story without much comedy, it definitely bums me out as a big fan of the emotional, character-driven sci-fi episodes of Futurama, and I think there are some really cool things they could have done, and maybe still could do with this story. Alright, hear me out. As you may know, I previously made an entire video on one offhanded remark from the episode The Why of Fry.
Leela, but she doesn't think much of me.
She must be the other.
And while many of my commenters seem to think that this was just Nibbler lying to Fry to get him to stay in the future, I'm not sure I agree there. The entire point of that scene was that Fry was given an opportunity to choose whether or not he is sent to the future, and to then cap that off with more manipulation from Nibbler feels sort of contradictory to the purpose of the sequence. I think that this likely was a story seed planted that unfortunately never yielded any fruit. Now, in this previous video, I rampantly speculated about what events of the show it could have referred to, or how they could have followed up these events. And interestingly, a lot of commenters said something that I hadn't thought of, that they believed
believed it was possible that Leela being the other was in reference to Fry and Leela having a child in the future who would ultimately be important to the ongoing existence of the universe, much like Fry. I didn't give this much thought until I learned about this unused story of Fry and Leela's son, and honestly, I think these ideas could probably fit together really nicely. Is it possible that these important future events that needed to be communicated by Fry and Leela's son were of universal importance? This would explain how Fry and Leela's ongoing relationship was of consequence to the Niblonians and their goals of keeping the universe safe. It also feels like a really big story that understandably was a struggle to fit into a 22-minute episode. So, big surprise, here goes Johnny once again pitching one final Futurama movie, just like in a couple other videos. If, and obviously there is absolutely no indication that this could or would ever happen, but if Futurama was given one final theatrical movie, something I would truly love to see, this seems like the absolute perfect story to cover for a number of reasons. For one, it completely solves the major issue the writers had with the story in the first place, that it was simply too complicated to fit into a 22-minute episode. You give this bad boy a 90-minute runtime and baby, that story's got room to breathe. You have much more freedom to fit in other more comedic subplots and flesh out the script with more jokes in addition to telling this ambitious time travel story. Hell, they already did a big ambitious time travel movie in season 5, and the extra runtime is what really helped it work.
Sheesh, this is confusing. And I bet it's gonna get a lot more confusing.
And let's be honest, this is a really cool and unique sci-fi premise that would work really well for a bigger Futurama story. It feels like a story that they would have done for the straight-to-DVD movie season had they thought of it sooner. But in addition to this, it could give them the opportunity to tie up a couple small loose threads left behind after the original run. You know, the ones I won't shut up about apparently. But either way, there is a really effective way to tell a great sci-fi story while tying in multiple elements from throughout Futurama's run to create one final epic big screen adventure for the Planet Express crew. If, for instance, Fry and Leela's son was traveling backwards in time, sent by the Niblonians to warn Fry and Leela of a future reemergence of the brain spawn, that ties really nicely into the why of Fry, especially considering this tease was never followed up.
If you ever need a savior again, just ask.
Oh, we will. We will.
Even if you don't buy into the idea that Nibbler meant anything substantial with the other comment, you cannot deny that this is a real loose thread. Hell, you could even tie in some other Fry and Leela focused stories, like the events of Meanwhile. What if the universe freezing in the series finale actually had bigger universal implications when it was reversed? The last we saw the brain spawn, Fry banished them to a parallel sort of void universe. What if when the universe froze, it somehow created a window of opportunity for the brain spawn to escape their prison and re-enter the universe, restarting their deadly hunt for information? It always felt to me like the brain spawn were the most important ongoing antagonists, especially in Fry's story, so bringing them back in a big way makes a lot of sense for a finale, at least to me. And of course, a story with a huge familial reveal for Fry and Leela's son would keep in line with the most important emotional aspects of Futurama, which tend to revolve around family. Learning of their son's existence could be a really big emotional moment. Or, hear me out, perhaps an even more heartbreaking reveal, such as, say, the idea that by traveling back in time to save the universe, Fry and Leela's son is in fact altering the time stream so that he ceases to exist. That could be the kind of emotional gut punch Futurama excels at. A character who's going back in time to change the future, knowing that it will eliminate himself from existence. You could have a really emotional scene between Fry, Leela, and their son, sharing one real moment together, knowing that it would be the first and last that they would ever experience. But you know, I'm just spitballing. So basically, if they were to transpose this story into a movie idea, they would get to tell their ambitious sci-fi story and allow room for more comedy. They could tie up some loose threads from the series itself, they could give us one of our patented family-centric emotional gut punches the show is known for, and they could give us fans one last massive hurrah for the series we love so much. Plus, isn't there something sort of poetically beautiful about Fry being flung far into the future, and his son being flung far into the past? Look, I know this all isn't likely, but a man can dream, right?
A man can dream.
Okay, so this section is actually made up of a bunch of segments from my old 2-hour Every Futurama Ranked video. However, I just pulled out episode segments about stories that only focus on Fry and Leela, and then instead of ranking order, I put them in chronological order. It might make some of the stuff I say confusing, but all of the analysis still holds, I think. Okay, enjoy.
Space Pilot 3000. What is there to say about the pilot that hasn't been said? It's truly one of the best series pilots I've ever seen. It sets up the world and characters so effortlessly and brilliantly, and it manages to be incredibly funny the entire time. The way it sets up Fry within the cold open should be studied by all writers. Its economy of storytelling is perfectly balanced, and the introduction of the future itself perfectly pulls you into the show as a viewer. Not to mention the way it sets up both Bender and Leela as well. I particularly love this little sequence near the end where Fry is basically given up and is just waiting for Leela to assign him his delivery boy career, the one that basically negates his entire fresh start in the year 3000. But Fry and Leela actually connect, as Fry laments the loss of everybody he's ever had in the year 2000. And Leela reveals that she was abandoned on Earth as a child and has no idea what galaxy she's from. This went such a long way to establish their connection and eventual romance, and it's a really sweet moment. Space Pilot 3000 is incredible. If you're writing a pilot, study this one. The series has landed. And immediately after the pilot, the series actually one-upped itself with The Series Has Landed, which is just such a great follow-up. While the pilot introduces us to the world of tomorrow, The Series Has Landed takes us one step further out. No, we aren't heading on a big space adventure or going to an alien planet, just the moon. All of the humor surrounding the amusement park on the moon is so funny, especially because it looks like theme park tech hasn't improved much in 1,000 years.
We're whalers on the moon, we carry a harpoon.
But what's so smart about this is that to all the characters from the future, going to the moon is not all that big a deal. It takes a few moments, it's like a tourist trap, but to Fry, going to the moon is a huge deal. And the end of the episode, when they discover the moon landing site and he conveys what the moon means to him, to Leela, it's just a perfect Futurama moment.
The moon was like this awesome, romantic, mysterious thing, hanging up there in the sky where you could never reach it, no matter how much you wanted to.
It really is beautiful. I don't know why I never noticed before.
This is honestly one of the all-time great moments in the entire show, and it's a great episode. A Flight to Remember. This was the first real direct parody that Futurama ever did. I generally prefer when they pay homage to things without directly parodying, but there are definitely some great aspects to this episode. This is actually the first time we learn much more about Hermes as they talk about his history as a limbo champion, and I think it's the first appearance of La Barbara too. This one is also the first real potential romantic moment between Fry and Leela as they look at this beautiful nebula together and nearly kiss. There's a fun Three's Company subplot where Fry has to pretend to be dating Amy in front of her parents, but also pretend to be dating Leela in front of Zap Brannigan, which makes for some really funny moments.
Let me think. Come and knock on our door. Na-na-na-na-na-na.
Oh dang, this episode also introduces Amy's parents, doesn't it? Lots of character expansions here. The main attraction is the story of Bender and the Countess, which is the Titanic parody, and must have been written shortly after the movie came out. There are some really fun moments here, and it's nice to see Bender care about someone, but I do think the ending beat could have maybe packed a bigger punch emotionally. Though this also teases Kif and Amy for the first time. Dang, this one really did lay down a lot of groundwork. Xmas Story. The first Christmas episode, or Xmas episode. This is one that I really love. From the Conan O'Brien cameo at the beginning to the John Goodman performance as Robot Santa, it's just fun top to bottom. But this episode also represents a real turning point in Fry and Leela's relationship, showcasing the first time they really start to relate to each other. Fry laments the loss of his family during the holiday, but insensitively doesn't think about the fact that Leela never even had a family. I love that the way he tries to make it up to her is buying an animal. The difficulty choosing between the parrot and the stink lizards is super funny, but the fact that he chose the parrot is actually also just a terrible gift. Hey, I'm sorry, here's a huge responsibility for the literal rest of your life. But when Leela saves Fry as he tries to retrieve the parrot, they have this really nice heart-to-heart, and this is a moment I just love so much.
You're lonely and I'm lonely, but together, we're lonely together.
Beautiful moment, great episode. I love it. Parasites Lost. Somehow Futurama took a very commonly parodied story, The Fantastic Voyage, and made it completely their own. Not only is this just an amazing and unique take on this premise, but it's one of the best episodes the show has to offer. One of the things I love most about this episode is the way they subvert the worm storyline. Rather than parasites negatively affecting Fry or turning him into some kind of monster like many sci-fi stories opt to do, they actually improve him in nearly every way, which of course leads to Leela falling for him. I also can't say enough about the concept of the holophoner. This is one of my favorite inventions in all of Futurama, an instrument that creates holograms. Obviously there's no way for this to be a real thing, but God, I really wish it were. It would for sure be the instrument of choice among psychedelic drug users. But I think the best part of this episode is the choice that Fry makes in the end. After Leela tells him that she loves what he's become, he rethinks this entire parasites thing. He fears that he took a developmental shortcut, and that Leela doesn't love Fry for Fry, but for the parasites. Fry sacrifices his newfound better life because he wants to become the person Leela wants on his own.
And man, do I love that message. This is an absolute classic episode, and I adore it. Time Keeps on Slippin'. Oh boy, do I love Time Keeps on Slippin'. The series' first foray into any type of time manipulation, as they initially opted not to do time travel. Ironically, their eventual 2 Emmy wins would both come from time travel episodes. But this was a good way to dip their toes into the time travel water, which features time skips launching the cast forward in time at random variables, though they of course can't remember what happens during the time skips. This episode is not only fun in that sci-fi premise, but it has such an absurdly funny setup that shouldn't work, but just does. Basically, the Harlem Globetrotters, who have their own planet in the future, come to Earth to challenge the entire planet to a game of basketball. Farnsworth uses something called chronotons to quickly grow a super mutant basketball team, which ends up causing the time skips. The fact that this episode is built around a Space Jam-esque Globetrotter game is so damn funny to me. Especially Bender's obsession with becoming a Globetrotter himself. It's always funny when Bender has random-ass dreams like folksing and cooking and basketball. But the real heart of the episode revolves, of course, around Fry and Leela, as during one of the time skips, the pair get married. But having missed the events of the time skip, Leela doesn't know what actually made her fall for Fry, and they immediately get divorced. The ending beat of the episode shows Fry realize that he literally moved the stars themselves to spell out a message, "I love you, Leela." Unfortunately, it's immediately destroyed in order to stop the time skips. I don't think any other show could have possibly made the Globetrotters whistling as sad as this does. Love and Rocket. Another weird romance story. This one between Bender and the Planet Express ship. I really like this conceptually, though it was kind of weird for them to just introduce the autopilot here. But overall, it's funny. They break a lot of rules in this one, like when the Planet Express ship rings the doorbell outside the window of Fry and Bender's apartment. That's just weird. But there's some great stuff in this episode. The big climax where the ship tries to merge its programming with Bender is really cool visually, and the subplot with Fry and Leela ends in a really sweet way. Even though the premise is a little basic, with Fry trying to find the perfect candy heart message for Leela, the ending is undeniably effective. Leela's air starts to run out, and Fry secretly gives her his air supply. When she realizes this, she gives him mouth-to-mouth and saves his life, and he spits out the perfect candy heart. This worked way better than it should have. Good episode. Teenage Mutant Leela's Hurdles. I love Teenage Mutant Leela's Hurdles, and not just because it's fun to say the name. This is probably the one episode that does an incredible job exploring Leela's relationship with her parents after that major reveal. A couple of episodes make valiant efforts like Less Than Hero and Zap Dingbat, but this is the one that really nails it. When the entire crew de-ages in a spa accident, Leela actually decides that she wants to remain a teenager and live an actual childhood with her parents. It does such a great job showcasing Leela's grief over her lost childhood and the lengths she would go to retain it, even if it means upending her entire life. Love me a good Leela-centric episode. It's also just fun to see the younger versions of the characters. One of my favorite moments is when Hermes and Dwight, now the same age, just share a laugh together like they're brothers. Not to mention this episode features Pazuzu, everyone's favorite French gargoyle. Overall, not just an incredibly funny episode, but a meaningful exploration of Leela as a character. The Why of Fry. So here's the finale of the Fry/Brainspawn storyline. Another excellent episode that not only follows up The Day the Earth Stood Stupid in a really effective way, but it also ties in some of the other hilarious storylines they introduced, like Fry becoming his own grandfather in Roswell That Ends Well. The return of the Brainspawn was incredibly effective. They did a great job reintroducing them as villains while also escalating their threat. The Death Star-like infosphere is a really cool design, and also the perfect name for my favorite Futurama wiki. But obviously the meat of the conflict comes with the reveal that Nibbler was the one who pushed Fry into the freezer tube all along, knowing that he was the only one who could stop the Brainspawn in the future. The devastation seen in Fry as he realizes that the most important thing that happened to him in his lifetime wasn't just happenstance, it was deliberately done to him against his will, is really well executed. Billy West's line delivery here is just heartbreaking.
What is one life weighed against the entire universe?
But it was my life.
Okay, look, and I'm not going to talk about how Nibbler mentions Leela as being the other again, but if the fact that they never follow that up bothers you as much as it did me, make sure to check out the video I made about it. The ending beat is incredible too, when Leela is so happy to see Fry after her terrible date, and tells him it doesn't matter if he isn't the most important person in the universe, it makes her happy just to see him.
Then I am the most important person in the universe.
And while, as I mentioned before, I wish the storyline had continued beyond the second episode or been extended into a larger arc, especially after Nibbler tells Fry they'll need his help again at the end, I still love what they managed to do in these 2 episodes. Really fun and effective storytelling that we hadn't really seen in this genre before. The Sting. This is an episode that I've always loved, but over time it's just continuously moved up my list further and further until it found itself at the very top spot. I think when it comes down to these top 3 episodes here, it's mostly a matter of taste. I can't say that The Sting is better than The Luck of the Fry-ish or Devil's Hands. I think all 3 are basically equally great, but The Sting speaks to my personal sensibilities so beautifully. When the Planet Express crew goes to collect space honey from a space bee colony, a bee attacks Leela. Fry jumps in front of Leela to save her and dies in the process. The rest of the episode can only be described as a fever dream, as Leela copes with the loss of Fry and struggles to differentiate dreams from reality. There are so many incredibly creative and beautiful sequences in this, particularly when Leela's dreams are taking over her mind. These are the things that I think puts this episode at number 1 for me, with my personal sensibilities really appreciating the trippy, reality-bending aspects of the episode. Whenever Leela dreams of Fry, he is 1, attempting to give her some kind of gift, and 2, ends the sequence by begging her to wake up, which jolts Leela awake, disappointed that she was only dreaming of Fry. Leela also continues to eat royal space honey to help her sleep, though the professor warns her that eating too much will put her in a permanent slumber. The major twist is, of course, that Leela was actually the one who took the space bee's venom during the initial attack, and the entire episode was her own coma dream. But the way this recontextualizes everything we saw in the episode is absolutely brilliant, as we learn that Fry sat by her side the entire time. The little toy that he gave her in the dream, he actually brought it to her in the hospital. You can see it on her nightstand. When he gave her his jacket, he really put his jacket over her in the hospital bed. Their adventure via sleigh through the ice fields, that location was on the television in her hospital room. And Fry asking her to wake up, that was literally Fry begging Leela to wake up from her coma. But I think the even darker implication is the space honey. As Leela became more and more confused trying to understand her dreams from reality, she nearly eats enough space honey to put her into a permanent sleep, believing it's the only way she can be with Fry again, in her dreams. But I believe this represents Leela giving up the fight to wake from her coma. If Leela had eaten that last spoonful of honey, I'm pretty sure she would have died. I think this is not only one of the best episodes of television ever made, but easily the most rewarding Futurama episode to rewatch. I continue to catch new genius details even years later, and I'll never get over how surprising and well crafted this story is. It's absolutely incredible, and it's my favorite episode of Futurama.
I thought maybe if you heard a familiar voice, it might help keep your mind together. But who knows if it really got through.
It got through, Fry. It got through.
The Farnsworth Parabox. I think as far as pure sci-fi premises go, the Farnsworth Parabox might be the best episode of Futurama. Almost a precursor to shows like Rick and Morty, the professor creates a box containing a parallel universe. The episode is not only really fun in its premise, but incredibly funny too, as the crew meets parallel versions of themselves and sees how their lives could have been different. Bender chose a gold finish, the professor tried to remove his own brain, and of course the big one, Fry and Leela are married. Which leads to one of my favorite jokes in the entire show that I think about constantly. When alternate Fry says that 1 year after their first date, he gave Leela a diamond scrunchie and they were married.
1 year later, I got beat up at a Neil Diamond concert by a guy named Scrunchy.
I can't say enough about how much I enjoy this episode. The characters interacting with their alternate selves is always funny, and it's easily one of my favorite premises in the entire run. It's a quintessential classic episode coming right at the end of the original run.
Will you go out with me?
Access denied.
Bender's Big Score, the first Futurama movie and final to show up on this list. And it's one that I think's a certified banger. Bender's Big Score was everything I hoped for out of a Futurama movie. It felt big and cinematic, and it also brought us back into the world of tomorrow after a years-long hiatus. The story is clever, funny, heart-wrenching, and subversive in the best ways, especially the Lars Fillmore storyline, which sees a time paradox duplicate of Fry win Leela's heart, though nobody knows that he's a Fry duplicate except Lars himself. I've talked about this a lot in other videos, but the story of Lars is great because it shows the type of developmental maturity that Fry needs to win over Leela. But even more interestingly, Lars' intercession in the timeline actually propels our Fry's development forward as well, and we see the change in our Fry much sooner in his timeline than Lars' development in his own timeline. And this wouldn't have happened if Lars hadn't entered the picture. It's just a nice little bit of writing, and I like it. The movie also just gets better on rewatch. Once you've got the story of Lars in your head, you can really appreciate the time he spends with Leela. My favorite scene is this date montage montage the pair go on, which also features some genius foreshadowing as they nearly die at every turn, which is hinting that Lars is a doomed time paradox duplicate. Overall, just an incredible Futurama story. I love it to death, and I always will. Into the Wild Green Yonder. The final Futurama movie and their second attempt at a series finale. There is plenty about this entry I like and plenty I dislike as well. It starts off pretty strong with a really fun lyricized take on the intro sung by Seth MacFarlane. While this movie has a lot going for it, I do feel like it can kind of feel overstuffed at times. I've talked a lot about it in other videos, but while there might be a few too many subplots, the ones that really work are Fry and Leela's parallel stories. While Leela is on the run from the law for her eco-feminist protesting, Fry is trying to help a secret organization discover and destroy an ancient evil known as the Dark One, and prevent it from destroying another ancient organism that's lying dormant in a violet dwarf star. The very same dwarf star that Leela's collective is trying to protect. So what works so well is the way these two stories come together, as it turns out Fry and Leela's separate goals are actually one and the same. And in the end, the ultimate solution comes down to Fry and Leela's trust in one another, which is a really nice way to potentially end the series. I've talked about this movie so much in other videos, so I don't want to go on too long, but it's solid. Rebirth. The very first episode of the revival era. Now, this episode had to do some work to clean up the Into the Wild Green Yonder cliffhanger, which obviously makes things a bit messy. On top of that, it was very fixated on the series being reborn premise, showing literally the entire cast be reborn through this weird device. So overall, this episode feels like it's trying to do maybe a little too much, but I think as I've watched and rewatched it, I've really grown to appreciate the Fry and Leela story here. It's a little sweaty in its explanation, what with the constant flashing back to reveal new information, but the reveal that both Fry and Leela are robots created by the opposite to cope with their loss is pretty sweet. Plus, every time I watch this episode, I laugh at the fact that Fry's personality was taken from security tapes of him in the bathroom.
I sure love Leela.
The idea that there are two Terminator-type robot versions of Fry and Leela living together out there is kind of nice, and the ending beat works really well for me. It's not Futurama at its best, but I think the Rebirth story maybe gets more flack than it should. Inagata de Leela. This was the second episode of the Comedy Central era, and people were mixed on it. Personally, I think it really succeeds through Zap Brannigan, who is really at the forefront of the story. The premise itself is a little sweaty, seeing Leela and Zap strand themselves in a Garden of Eden type scenario, but the humor from Zap is undeniable. Not only is the Billy West performance hilarious, but they continuously cut to these really creative, transcredible exploits of Zap Brannigan sections, which are designed to look like an old-timey TV series. They're really cool visually and super funny. Don't want to beat a dead horse, but this is another that sort of tries to have its cake and eat it too, Fry and Leela with the ending, but it's a small part of an otherwise relatively fun platform for Zap to be hilarious. The late Philip J. Fry. This is without a doubt the best episode of the revival era, and it rightfully won the show its second Emmy. The late Philip J. Fry is an absolute masterpiece. I've actually talked about it way too much on this channel already. In fact, my very first Futurama video was on this episode specifically, and y'all enjoyed that one apparently. The episode starts by focusing on how Fry's persistent lateness disappoints Leela. He attempts to make it up to her with a birthday dinner at Cavern on the Green, but he's roped into testing the professor's forward-traveling time machine with Farnsworth and Bender. As he's recording his birthday card for her, the machine is flung forward into the future, making it seem like he abandoned Leela to go to Hedonism Bot's party. To make matters worse, there's a huge explosion at that party, leading the crew to believe that the trio has died. The rest of the episode focuses on two parallel stories. One is Fry, Bender, and the professor continuing to move forward in time until they can find backwards time-traveling technology to return home, and the other shows Leela's time as the new head of Planet Express and subsequent success the company saw under her leadership. This is an incredibly effective storytelling structure. I love how it brings the show to completely new places in both timelines. By traveling far into the future, we get to see all kinds of new settings that we otherwise haven't gotten to see, and in Leela's timeline, we get to see more familiar possibilities for the future of Planet Express, New York, and the remaining characters. But the highlight of the episode is still Fry and Leela. Fry tries desperately to get back to see Leela, while Leela spends her entire life angry at Fry for abandoning her. And though she sees massive career success, she always pines for her lost love story. When Fry's birthday card flies out of the time stream and hits her in the back of the head, it clears everything up, making her feel even worse for her lifelong resentment.
My whole life I've been mad at him, and it wasn't his fault.
Leela walks to Cavern on the Green. She blasts a message into the ceiling, creating stalagmites over time. Meanwhile, in the year 1 billion, Fry discovers the message.
Dear Fry, our time together was short, but it was the best time of my life.
I cannot overstate how incredibly effective this reveal is. We literally see that Leela achieves massive success in her lifetime, bringing Planet Express to new heights under her leadership, and even still, the best time in her life was the time she spent with Fry. And this is what Fry needed to hear to realize that even if they can't get home,
he still got to spend that important time with Leela, and that's what life is about. The final sequence of the episode is really amazing too, especially visually, as they watch the death and rebirth of the universe as the new Big Bang creates an identical universe after theirs, allowing the trio to place themselves back into place in the timeline in that new universe. The episode delivers absolutely everything I want in a Futurama episode. It's incredibly funny, driven by an excellent sci-fi premise with a real focus on the characters' interpersonal relationships. And of course, it's got one of the most effective and incredible heartstring-tugging moments in the series. An all-time classic for sure. Prisoner of Benda. This is such a smart and fun episode, which showcases a device where characters can switch their bodies and minds. However, the problem is that two bodies that have switched are incapable of switching back, so they have to use other bodies to facilitate more mind swap. Ken Keeler actually wrote an entire peer-reviewed mathematical proof to make the mind switching work when returning everyone's minds back to their original bodies. But they also just have so much fun showcasing the misadventures the characters get up to in other bodies. Fry and Leela hooking up at a restaurant in Zoidberg and the professor's bodies will always stand out to me as a hilarious moment, though maybe not as much as Washbucket confessing her love for Scruffy in Amy's body.
Oh, it would be sweet for a while, but in the back of our minds we'd know that I'm a man and your janitorial equipment.
Add on the fact that this one heavily features the Globetrotters and their showboating razzmatazz algebra, and you've got yourself a classic episode. Easily one of my favorites from the revival era. The mutants are revolting. Ironically, number 50 is the 100th episode, and I think the coolest thing it does to celebrate is have a big status quo shifting event that actually alters the world of Futurama. This one is all about Leela being outed as a mutant, meaning she isn't allowed on the surface. She's then forced to live in the sewers, where she decides to lead a mutant uprising to fight for their rights to live with everyone else. I really like this idea. I guess my one issue with it is that it kind of makes Leela look selfish. She never thought to fight for the rights of mutants until after she was personally affected by the way society marginalizes them, but at least it makes for a fun story. I appreciated how they used the band Devo, and visually the land Titanic sinking into the street is super funny to me, though ultimately I'm not sure that the big twist was all that effective, which involves the reveal of Leela's grandmother. Really feels like Leela should have been introduced to her grandmother sooner. But overall, I really appreciate the 100th episode, Overclockwise. This episode was the series' third ever attempt at a series finale, and it is a very strong entry, revolving around Bender overclocking his processor and both Cupert and the professor being prosecuted for violating the terms of service on their bending unit. This one has some really beautiful and creative sequences, particularly when Bender becomes this sort of computer god. It's got some great laughs, some fun sci-fi execution, and of course the classic pull at the heartstrings moment to cap it off as Fry and Leela read their future together. If I had one complaint about this episode, it's that when Leela decides to leave Planet Express, she disappears from the episode entirely, and if the series had ended on a largely Leela-less episode, I would have been pretty disappointed. A Farewell to Arms. This is another where I feel the premise is super sweaty, as it tries to play on the end of the world Mayan calendar concept, but fortunately it succeeds in its character work and sweet moments. I've actually talked about this one in a couple other videos, and the premise is so sweaty that it just feels really difficult to even explain it all again, but I'll do my best to summarize it more quickly. Basically, when the world is ending, Fry gives up his spot on the spaceship that will save a chunk of humanity, and he gives it to Leela. Then, when it turns out Mars was the doomed planet, not Earth, and Mars starts barreling towards Earth, the crew has to literally jump from the surface of Mars to the surface of Earth. Since Leela is injured, she can't make the jump, and Fry attempts to save her. Now, the entire episode, Fry's been asking Leela to take his hand for various reasons, and in the end, when she takes his hand as he tries to save her, their arms both get pulled out of their sockets. But the final shot is just so beautiful as we see Fry and Leela's hands holding each other, floating through space forever. This sweet payoff elevates the entire episode for me. Fun on a bun. Alright, this is one I'm very mixed on, because I really don't love the general premise, but it does have an undeniably effective final act. While at Oktoberfest, Leela breaks up with Fry, who then seemingly falls into a sausage grinder and dies, though as it turns out, he actually falls through this ice into an underground Neanderthal society, forgetting who he is and believing that he's a Neanderthal himself. Meanwhile, in her grief, Leela eternal sunshines herself to forget Fry. But throughout the episode, things keep tugging at both of their memories to have them remember one another. It ends in this big weird battle between the above ground society and the Neanderthals, and in that undeniably effective moment, Fry and Leela remember each other while doing battle and then kiss. There's this really great little sequence where you see all of their memories reconnecting in their minds, and they're all little snapshots from some of the best moments in the history of Fry and Leela. So I guess my thing here is that the episode itself is sort of a sweaty mess. I just don't really care for the Eternal Sunshine parody or the Neanderthal storyline, but like I said, the way they come together in the
the end is just such a nice moment that it makes me want to bump the episode up a lot more than maybe it deserves. I guess that's one of my weaknesses here. If an episode features a particularly impressive, heartfelt moment, it tends to bump the entire thing up in my ranking, even if the rest of the episode is lackluster. Fry and Leela's Big Fling. I really like the first act of this episode, as Fry and Leela try desperately to find alone time, which is interrupted by their friends and coworkers over and over again. After years of them sort of slowly easing their way into Fry and Leela finally being a thing, it was nice to have such a clear and plain confirmation in such a fun way. The rest of the episode definitely has some fun stuff going for it too. The automated getaway that Fry and Leela go on is neat technologically. Bringing in Leela's ex Sean after only being mentioned by name was a funny callback. And even weirder, we get the return of both Dr. Banjo from A Clockwork Origin and Gunther from Mars University in this Ape Society storyline. And the twist that Fry and Leela were actually exhibits in a zoo was unexpected. Not a perfect episode, but some great moments and ideas. Leela and the Gene Stalk. This is another episode that I've got mixed feelings on. I really like the idea that Leela is starting to mutate further as she gets older. That's really good stuff. But the whole Beanstalk storyline is not very Futurama, if you ask me. This one, once again, is saved by its heartfelt story with Fry and Leela. In the end, Leela nearly breaks things off with Fry because of her mutations, but Fry refuses because he loves Leela for Leela. He doesn't care if she's covered in tentacles, and I think that's real sweet. Of course, due to the status quo, Leela is cured by the very end of the episode, but the heartfelt moment is still very meaningful. Plus, this one has this really fun little crossover.
What time is it? Time for you to shut up!
Meanwhile, the ultimate and final series finale, and a true masterpiece. Meanwhile not only delivers an incredible and heartfelt story surrounding Fry and Leela's relationship, but it does so in such a beautiful and thoughtful package, all through a classic sci-fi premise. When Leela goes through a near-death experience at Lunar Park, Fry decides it's time to propose. He uses a button created by Farnsworth that sends its users back in time 10 seconds to steal a bunch of beautiful diamonds for Leela's engagement ring, and then asks Leela to meet him at the Vampire State Building at sunset if she agrees to his proposal. When she doesn't show up on time, Fry jumps off the building, not wanting to live without Leela, before realizing that his watch was actually wrong because he'd been using the time button. Fry uses the button once more, but unfortunately, he jumped more than 10 seconds prior, forcing him into a perpetually falling time loop. This premise is dark, but man, it's cool, and I love the visual of Fry falling and reappearing at the top of the building over and over again. Fortunately for Fry, the professor recognizes what's happening, and the crew makes their way to Fry while protected in a time-proof shelter. They manage to save Fry, but destroy the button in the process. The professor is shredded across the time stream, and time is frozen in place except for Fry and Leela. The following sequence is one of my favorites in all of Futurama, and it brings catharsis to the series-long buildup of Fry and Leela's relationship. The catharsis that wasn't quite present in the previous Futurama finales.
That makes me feel angry!
Fry and Leela grow old together, traveling the frozen world and never tiring of one another. It's beautiful, but I think what's best about this sequence is just the entire frozen in time concept. The way that it literally takes a snapshot of the world we know and love, the world we've been invested in since 1999. It allows us one last chance to sit in and appreciate that world for all its intricacies. One last chance to live in Futurama before it ends forever. There's a lot of debate over what the end of the episode means, as the professor finds a way to fix the time freeze and claims that it will send them back to before he conceived of the time button. Many argue that it means the entire series is in a perpetual loop, especially because as soon as the series finale finished back in 2013, Comedy Central immediately aired the pilot episode. But I think there's some wiggle room there since conceived of the time button is so vague. Either way, I love that it left us with something to debate, and the more important aspect to the ending to me is the final interaction between Fry and Leela. After living an entire lifetime together happily, they're asked to go back, which would erase their experience from their memories, but also give them a chance to do it all again.
What do you say? Want to go around again?
I do.
It's such a perfect ending. This episode is top tier, and it's a perfect finale. I love it.
Folks, it's actually here. Nearly 10 years after the previous series finale, Futurama has returned with a brand new episode titled The Impossible Stream. After starting its life on Fox, moving direct to DVD for a few movies, and then landing on cable at Comedy Central, this new season of Futurama is dropping on Hulu to likely live out the rest of its days on streaming, or Disney Plus outside the US. But how was the latest revival's premiere? Did it live up to the hype? Did it fall into some of the same pitfalls that the previous era did? Well, there's a ton to dig into and go over, so let's get into it. Welcome back
To the world of tomorrow!
Okay, so there is obviously so much to talk about with this premiere, but right off the bat, I want to say that after being very apprehensive about the show returning, I'm very happy with this premiere. Not only did I find it very funny, but the ways it followed up the previous finale, as well as other Futurama storylines, were incredibly satisfying. I do think people might find the Fulu storyline a little too on the nose. It does feel like they really laid it on thick with the revival jokes, but after 10 years, I personally don't mind it, especially because I just found those jokes to be funny. But let's start getting into the details because I have so much I want to talk about, and spoilers ahead, obviously. First up, the show has new title cards when it starts now, beginning with Hulu Presents, a Hulu original, a 20th century television animation production, which makes sense. Even shows that transition to being streaming originals tend to be branded that way. But I actually like the mystery vibes and score behind these new title cards. And the episode begins directly following up the events of Meanwhile, which was a major requirement for me. This also makes sense. They directly addressed the end of Into the Wild Green Yonder in the first Comedy Central episode, Rebirth, but Meanwhile's ending left a little bit more room for them to ignore it if they wanted to. This episode opens on the world still being frozen from the events of the previous finale, with the professor explaining the events from his point of view at the end of that last episode.
Professor's lab notes. Final entry. Time has been frozen for an unknown length of time.
We see the events of the finale as we remember them with the now iconic "wanna go around again" line, and those events then transition into the present with our first of many winks to the revival effort.
Did someone switch the universe off and on?
It feels like we got rebooted.
This is pretty classic for Futurama. They referenced their first cancellation in Bender's Big Score, and the second in Rebirth with their opening sequences, though this episode definitely makes a lot more jokes about it throughout the episode than either of those last ones. But Futurama also kind of invented revivals, so I give it a pass. But let's talk about this new intro sequence. They've actually made changes. For one, the Hulu Rama logo that we saw from the trailers that transitions to Futurama is actually in the titles for this run, which will probably be weird for people watching on Disney Plus, but oh well. And our first title caption is "Avenged" in bloody red letters, a direct follow-up to the caption from the previous finale, which said "Avenge Us" in the same font. For the intro sequence differences, there are actually a few changes. The first is a totally blink and you'll miss it thing. As we zoom into New York, you can now see the Vampire State Building on the right side, which made its one and only appearance in the previous series finale, Meanwhile, with Fry jumping off of it. In this first little location, you can now see the Nimbus flying in the background on the top left of the screen. As we fly to the next location, we can now see the Momco building in the background, a major skyline change. This is actually kind of an interesting one. We first see Mom's skyscraper in A Fistful of Dollars with a similar but slightly different design to this building, labeled Mom's Friendly Robot Company. They seemed to use this design in the Fox era and then transition to this newer design in the Comedy Central run. This is pretty inconsequential, but the characters flying through the tubes have changed as well, Kif being a notable addition, and you can also see 3 Omicronian ships flying overhead just before it transitions again. In the final transition, we can now see Bender dangling from the Planet Express ship, presumably singing, a reference to the second episode of the entire series, The Series Has Landed. And the last visual change I've noticed is that in the final shot with the giant screen, you can now see the Robot Arms apartments on the left side, of course where Fry and Bender have lived for almost the entire series. But the most important thing is that the full title sequence has returned. During the Comedy Central era, they almost always cut the title sequence short, including removing the old cartoon clips from the screen at the end. But to me, the biggest sin was always removing this final music cue from the theme song. The episode properly starts by actually addressing the 10-year time jump, but explaining it away with the massive disruption in time from Meanwhile, which I think was a smart move. It would have felt weird if the crew had just been on adventures for the past 10 years that we had never seen, but it also gives them an excuse to comedically explain away their canonical ages having any importance.
Did we get older? Younger? Science holds no answers.
But I love how this transition and the revelation that they're now in the year 3023 leads to the episode premise. And Fry basically has an existential crisis about how long he's been in the future, deciding to set a goal for himself. I also love that the episode is about Leela choosing to support Fry's goal, no matter how stupid it is. It's nice that they're pretty firmly making Fry and Leela's relationship a priority, even in this mostly unrelated plot. Some good reassurance to the audience that they'll handle them well in the revival. Also, let's take a look at this shot of Fry when he sets his initial goal goal to watch every TV show ever, this is the funniest off-model pose I've ever seen, and I kind of love it. I'm not gonna list them all, but the quick scroll down the list of future TV shows has some very funny little details in there. There are literally 66 TV show titles on the list, and you should definitely pause and read them all. Some of my favorites are Mets vs. Godzilla, Disenchantment, the first ever Futurama reference to Groening's newest show, Disenchantment, Alien vs. Predator vs. Bluey, Back to the Present, too many to name really. There's really funny stuff in there. But man, possibly my biggest laugh in the entire episode is the latest Scary Door, or the Scary Mirror, as they acknowledge the rise of Black Mirror as our modern Twilight Zone equivalent.
What was once a creepy story about a book is now about an e-reader that's too greasy to hold.
Fry ends up deciding to try and binge all my circuits, and they sort of use it as a stand-in for Futurama itself in their meta commentary here.
Which final season? They got canceled like 3 or 4 times.
It was so great to see more clips of All My Circuits. Those have always been a highlight of the series for me, and the clips we see in this episode are so funny.
Calculon! But you weren't due back from the time travel convention until...
yesterday?
But I'm glad that they found a way to futurize the concept of Fry binging a show, fitting him into a still suit, a Dune reference, that sustains him while he binges for basically an entire year. It would have kind of been boring if it was just about Fry sitting on the couch watching All My Circuits. And they find a fun way to turn this into a future dilemma as well, with Fry's consciousness being tied to his binge, meaning if the series ends before it untangles, he will die. The solution, again, pretty on the nose, to go to Hulu and get them to start producing more episodes so that his binge doesn't stop. This is definitely the most meta they've gone with a return episode, referencing the cancellation and revival so often, but personally I don't mind it. I think for the most part the jokes are very funny, and it also ties into enough aspects of the show's history to make it a fun ride. The Hulu executives are even the same execubots we saw in Bender Should Not Be Allowed on Television, and other television related episodes, like Calculon 2.0, and they directly address a majorly important plot point from the Comedy Central era to make this actually make sense.
There's one teensy hitch. You know the star of the show, Calculon? He's dead.
I'm so glad this wasn't something they ignored, and I hope it's a sign that they won't ignore much else continuity-wise while moving through this new era. This truly just felt like it picked up exactly where the show left off. At the end of Calculon 2.0, the robot devil was just fed up with Calculon, so he's of course incredibly eager to send him back to Earth.
Oh, glorious rapture. To return to the draped proscenium once more.
Will you shut up and get into the resurrection canon?
I also love that we get a Dan Castellaneta cameo here for the Robot Devil. Such a great character. Glad they got him in the premiere. And we also get the return of Slurms Mackenzie, though he does not seem to be doing well. And I think they escalate things pretty effectively here. Fry starts watching at 2x speed, which means that they have to basically just make new All My Circuits episodes perpetually to keep him alive, which completely burns out the writers, and so they replace them all with Bender. Okay, I also loved how this room of writers are just character models for a ton of the current Futurama writers. This guy on the left is clearly designed after Patrick Verone. You've got Eric Horsted's head right here. This head on the floor is one of the new writers, Shireen Najafi, who I have actually worked with in the past. She's great and very funny. Over here we've got 2 other new writers, Cody Ziegler, and lastly Ariel Ladenson, who hilariously is actually wearing the same outfit as in her Instagram profile picture. I had to look her up to figure out who this was, but I love that attention to detail, and I think it's just fun to acknowledge the real world writers room of Futurama here. So All My Circuits ends up getting canceled because they were making it too fast with a robot writer, and I really liked the way that they tried to ease Fry out of his binge by transitioning the show into a synced up live performance. It's a cool concept. Unfortunately, it goes terribly wrong. They end up destroying Fry's binge chair, with everyone believing that Fry is dead.
He's dead! I killed him by encouraging his hopes and dreams. How could I have been so stupid?
Obviously, Fry didn't die, and this was immediately revealed, but it is nice to just see them double down on Leela's love for Fry with her devastation at the thought of losing him. Again, it continues to encourage me that they'll handle their relationship properly in this run. There's also a little tag where Fry talks to a panel at the White House that includes Nixon, where they talk about the dangers of streaming TV, and it seems like they're really just trying to reassure the audience that this revival was made with care.
Don't reboot a show if the quality isn't gonna be there.
Which is, again, on the nose, but personally I think the episode delivers, even when some of the episodes in the previous run of the series perhaps didn't deliver on that quality. I really can't tell you how nervous I was about this show coming back, but honestly, the first time watching this premiere episode, I almost felt giddy. They did so much that I hoped they would. They directly followed up Meanwhile in a way that both fit the storyline and addressed the time jump between seasons. They didn't ignore status quo shifts like Fry and Leela's relationship or Calculon's death, and most importantly, it was funny. I think the one episode we have that can be directly compared to this one is Rebirth. The very very first episode of the Comedy Central era. Both followed up episodes that were meant to be finales. Rebirth used a little bit more of a metaphorical storyline with the characters literally being reborn, while the Impossible Stream did a bit more of a meta storyline with the All My Circuits reboot. But personally, I like the Impossible Stream a lot more than Rebirth and Execution, and honestly, more than a lot of episodes in the Comedy Central era. In my opinion, this is a much stronger start, especially after a 10-year gap. There are some stories that I absolutely love from the 52 Comedy Central era episodes, but they had some very frustrating writing tendencies. The show has always had serialized elements, but it felt like they were very intent on maintaining the status quo in its episodic nature, especially when it came to things like character relationships. And in doing so, it made some of my favorite characters do super unlikable things that would have been fine earlier in the show, but come across as heartless so deep into this run. The way Amy treats Kif in episodes like Proposition Infinity come to mind. One thing that was interesting about the meta dialogue in this episode was this line.
How about picking up All My Circuits for 20 episodes?
With an option for 20 more!
Maybe a movie.
And I think this definitely gives us insight into the possibilities of what we'll see from Futurama moving forward. We've already got that 20 episode pickup. It sounds like there's a major possibility for another 20 on the back end of this order, something I fully expect to happen. But the possibility of a movie is what really excites me. Look, I know it's very unlikely that we'll get a theatrically released Futurama movie, but that is still my dream. Not a movie that's actually 4 episodes smashed together like the DVD movies, but a big, properly structured, ambitious Futurama movie. We'll see. A man can dream, right? Cue man can dream clip. Episode 5 of Futurama's latest revival on Hulu just released, and it had some major developments in character relationships that I expect made a lot of fans happy. The latest episode, titled Related to Items You Viewed, makes major strides in Fry and Leela's relationship, gives us a classic Bender insecurity storyline, and lampoons Amazon with its motherly corporate overlord. But did I like it? Did you like it? Stay tuned! You know, I was actually pretty surprised to see that the response to this episode seems to be the most positive of the season. There's a lot I like about this episode, but on first viewing, I cannot say that's what I expected the reaction to be. But obviously, this one made some big moves, namely moving Leela in with Fry and Bender, which sadly puts an end to Fry and Bender's ongoing cabbage fights.
Welcome to your new home.
Our new home.
I did speculate about this development after the trailers, so it was nice to be vindicated there. These are the kinds of status quo shifts that I'm really happy to see in this newest era. They're meaningful for the characters, but aren't necessarily going to change up the formula too drastically. I mean, the number of times we've been at Leela's apartment in the series is probably under 10, even though we did see it last week. But we even saw Leela crashing at Fry's place in the Comedy Central run in episodes like Free Will Hunting. It's just nice that this latest era of Futurama, they aren't even playing around with the will they, won't they stuff anymore. Fry and Leela are a couple, they live together now, that's that. And they use this status quo shift to dive into probably our most classically Bender story so far this season, which I love to see. Bender ends up incredibly jealous.
Fry and me, we had everything. Cabbage fights, everything.
Bender's insecurities are just classic Futurama subject matter, and this is a perfect inciting incident to set off one of Bender's fits of jealousy. A good comparison is Jurassic Bark, where he gets wildly jealous when Fry starts preparing to bring Seymour back from fast fossilization, or The Beast with a Billion Backs when Fry moves to Yivo's universe. So yeah, this felt like the perfect combination of stories. A Fry and Leela development that's a long time coming, leading into a complete Bender drama queen storyline. I particularly love how at this point everybody is just kind of over Bender's drama. He's absolutely sobbing at the Planet Express roundtable, and exactly 0 people care about it.
You want to know why I'm crying? I'll tell you why.
Here we go.
The other major aspect of this episode is that once again Mom is running Planet Express out of business, but now in 3023 they've had MomCourt evolve into the future equivalent of Amazon. I mean, it's pretty clear, it's called Momazon, though it's definitely a bit of a departure from the writer's feelings on Amazon in the early 2000s.
I'm gonna take this and buy 5 shares of Amazon.com.
A risk taker. That's my boy.
Obviously, Amazon has blown up to outrageous levels since that episode was written. I think the name Momazon is maybe a tad too on the nose. We probably could have just used MomCorp or Mom's Friendly Robot Company, and the parallels to Amazon still would have been clear, but this development and evolution for the company makes a lot of sense. They've always been seen as the giant corporate counterpart to Planet Express.
Here's the big enchilada.
Mom's Friendly Delivery Company.
Previously, they were just seen as being on an entirely separate level to Planet Express. The only one who considered going toe-to-toe with them was that guy in Future Stock. Hermes kind of summed it up perfectly here.
We can't compete with Mom.
Her company is big and evil. Ours is small and neutral.
But one thing we've seen in the 20 years since that episode was written is how large Amazon has become, and the ruthless tactics they use that ultimately drive smaller companies out of business, undercutting prices because their profits are so large elsewhere that they can afford to do it. And that's exactly what we see Mom doing in this story.
We're being driven out of business by Mamazon. We can't compete with their free deliveries.
This episode also heavily features the moon, which is the location of Mamazon's warehouse, and so we get glimpses of most of our known moon inhabitants. It's funny, I hadn't really thought about how there's still so little on the moon in the future. Pretty much just Luna Park, as seen in the series, has landed, and later meanwhile, this moon farmer's farm, seen in a few different episodes, and this town settlement called Aldrin's Gulch, obviously named after Buzz Aldrin. It was first seen in The Silence of the Clamps and revisited for the first time here in this latest episode. The town looks just about the same in this one, with a couple of changes to the building's signs. Classically, they were super attentive to detail here. Pretty much all of the moonfolk protesting Mamazon at the town hall meeting could be seen as background characters back in Silence of the Clamps. Plus, we get nearly every moon character that's ever had a speaking role, including the farmer and his 3 robot daughters, the Luna Park mascot Craterface, and Sheriff Furley, who was first introduced in Silence of the Clamps. Mom ends up interrupting the ruckus to try and bribe the moonfolk into accepting the Mamazon warehouse, and this entire scenario feels very reminiscent of Mom's first ever appearance, when she interrupted the auction to try and outbid Fry for the anchovies back in A Fishful of Dollars. All this is to say, I appreciate that when they utilize previous characters and locations, they make sure they maintain that attention to detail. I don't know how many fans remember someone like Sheriff Furley, but here he is, back at Aldrin's Gulch, as he should be. He's their sheriff. I also have to say, of these first 5 episodes, this one looks the best for sure. It feels like the animators were really getting their feet back under them, with characters occasionally looking a little bit off model, but this one seems to have mostly found their footing. Plus, it has some incredibly detailed sequences, particularly the Mamazon warehouse. This thing is so dynamic, so many characters, and the widest shots have tons of 3D models for robots and drones that blend in seamlessly. And with so many robots enjoying each other's company, this ties into the ongoing Fry-Leela Bender conflict, as Bender decides to quit Planet Express and join Mamazon.
There's thousands of robots to hang out with. And if a couple hundred get girlfriends, leaving me alone and devastated, so what?
It really does feel like this episode has pretty much locked in with all its characters, where the first few of the season maybe had some missteps. Bender's jealousy pushing him to betray his friends in a cool warehouse with a ton of other robots? Spot on. But I think my favorite thing about this episode is the time we get to spend with Fry and Leela. Once they get home, they start buying stuff from Mamazon and we're treated to a fun redecorating montage, kind of reminiscent of Fry and Bender and I Roommate. But man, does it feel good to just spend a chunk of this episode with Fry and Leela doing coupley things. It really has felt like their relationship dynamic has needed to evolve. We got a little taste of the pair of them trying to go on dates and being foiled in Fry and Leela's big fling, but there's no reason why we shouldn't get new types of conflicts that stem from Fry and Leela's relationship, not from the wishy-washy nature of it. And that is pretty much what we see here. They both end up ordering so much conflicting home decor, and that causes them to bicker, and it's played out perfectly in my opinion.
This is just the standard moving in together fight.
Well, I'm glad I get to fight it with you.
I love this. They don't even really have the characters question if they made the wrong call or consider moving into separate places again. It's just a little speed bump in the relationship, and it gives me a lot of confidence in how they'll treat Fry and Leela's relationship moving forward. As far as the remainder of the episode goes, I really enjoyed the sci-fi dilemma. Basically, the Mamazon warehouse is made of self-replicating nanoparticles, so it keeps growing bigger and bigger, forcing Mom and the Planet Express crew to team up. I love a rivalry turned reluctant team up. However, I am losing my mind that Farnsworth and Ignar are standing right next to each other for a lot of this episode, and we still haven't even gotten a single acknowledgement that they're father and son since it was revealed in Bender's game. Like, can we get anything? What was the point in that reveal if it was never going to be of any consequence ever again? God, Bender's game frustrates the hell out of me. I personally loved the resolution to this episode too, and they set it up so well. They failed to get into the warehouse because Mom's invasive AI had locked even her out of it, but the self-replicating particles of the warehouse basically expand beyond the ship and the characters, placing them into the warehouse so that they can then save Bender. And though this made it very clear to me what the ultimate resolution would be, I still loved the execution. Basically, everyone is prepared to die since the sun has been blotted out by the warehouse, when the warehouse ends up expanding beyond the sun.
If these smells are correct, it will soon contain the entire known universe.
Not only did I love this resolution on a sci-fi level, but on a commentary level too. Amazon is fucking everywhere, man. You cannot escape it. Also, this was like the 4th time that Fry and Leela have said goodbye to each other around this part of the Planet Express building. Farewell to Arms and Overclockwise come to mind. Also, damn, Farnsworth was the standout character comedically in this episode.
The amazing Meccano Man in trouble? To the ship!
I kinda love that even though all of the characters, Farnsworth in particular, were exhausted by Bender's whining, they drop everything to help him. Love a found family trope, baby. And how about this spin on a classic Farnsworth line?
Sweet vampire Moses!
Honestly, I like this variation better than them just repeating the Sweet Zombie Jesus line. Love to see it. So after initially watching this episode, I felt relatively middling about it, but the more I think about it, the more I think they're really finding their groove here. The characters all felt spot on, they moved the relationship dynamics forward in a meaningful way, and built conflict around that shift. I expect some people still might find Mamazon to be too topical, even though I would argue that that's not what topicality means, but they used that storyline in a way that fully fits the evolution of the series, especially the relationship between Planet Express and MomCorp. Well, we made it, folks. The end of Futurama's first season on Hulu. Their first season in 10 entire years. And did they close out their return season with a bang? Personally, yeah, I think they did. The season finale, titled All the Way Down, delivers the one truly sci-fi focused episode of the season with an inspired look at simulation theory. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Not just for some top-notch science fiction, but for what I think is some really impressive subtext as well. So let's wrap out our coverage of Futurama's new season and dive all the way down. Subscribe. Futurama's finale basically cuts right to the chase, immediately introducing a pixelated low-res version of Planet Express and revealing that the professor has created a simulation of the entire universe. Love when an episode just immediately dives into its central premise, especially because there's a lot to mine out of simulation theory here. This is the first episode penned by the show's co-creator David X. Cohen since Free Will Hunting in 2012. And honestly, this is my favorite Futurama script from Cohen since the original run. But like Free Will Hunting, it tackles incredibly existential themes, this time not only through Bender, but through the rest of the crew and the simulated versions of the crew. The title of the episode is derived from an old expression that alludes to the problem of infinite regress. The phrase stems from the concept of the world turtle, the one that holds the flat earth on its back in mythology. The question is, if the world is on a turtle, what is the turtle on? Well, it's on a larger turtle, of course, and what's under that turtle? Well, it's turtles all the way down. Hence this episode's simulation in a simulation in a simulation. The episode has a little bit in common with the Rick and Morty episode The Ricks Must Be Crazy, where Rick creates a micro-universe to power his car battery, in that it's got a universe in a universe in a universe. An existential story in itself, however, with these universes being simulated, it's definitely a bit more focused on that simulation theory in general. But it is funny, Rick and Morty started airing about 3 months after Futurama's last finale, meanwhile, and so they have basically aired their entire 61 episode run in the shadow of Futurama, attempting to tackle sci-fi stories in ways that Futurama hadn't. Now, with Futurama's return, they have to avoid covering sci-fi ideas too similarly to Rick and Morty. Honestly, this only has a few similarities to the Microverse episode, and Rick and Morty actually won an Emmy for their riff on the time button from Meanwhile, which they directly call out as being a concept from Futurama.
A device that lets you save your place like in a video game, but in real life so that you can try stuff and then go back to your save point. Yes, Morty, I saw it on Futurama.
Even though it was in simulated form, I really loved Fry and Leela's little date in Space Italy. It is pretty funny that despite last week's episode, every other story this season has made a point to highlight that Fry and Leela are a couple and that they're doing really well together.
I just can't understand how it doesn't fall down.
Let me give you a hand.
Honestly, I think what I loved most about this episode is that it really did make me think more about simulation theory. I've never really looked into it seriously before, but they did such a great job breaking it down into concepts that anyone can understand through the dialogue and character interactions. Basically, the professor explains that there are limitations of his universe simulation due to the limitations of his computer's processing abilities.
So I had to have the information travel outward gradually at a fixed speed.
Like the speed of light in our universe?
Right!
I also appreciate that the one really pressing the professor on these ideas is Amy. It feels like only a handful of episodes really embrace her scientific side, and she did get her doctorate back in the episode That Darn Cats.
So your programming shortcut is like quantum mechanics in our world?
Exactly like that!
I also think it was genius for them to further explore the simulated universe through Bender's eyes, a character who is constantly going through his own existential crises. After Amy calls him artificial intelligence, he not only goes through another one of these crises, but starts intensely relating to the simulated versions of the characters. Through his own existential baggage, he empathizes with them and tries to protect their universe at all costs.
They deserve the same respect as any other living creature.
This leads to the professor using a sewage-fueled hydroelectric dam to properly power the simulation, allowing it to continue running and increasing its resolution, which leads to the next major development, and really what the entire episode is built around. That simulation of the universe then develops its own simulation of the universe.
Sweet facsimile of Space Italy! A simulation? Within a simulation?
The progression of the simulation stories escalate pretty perfectly. We basically see them catch up to the current episode's story. There's even a little low-res sequence of the simulation playing out the events of this season's premiere before that. So the simulation catching up to this episode means that they then start to question whether or not they might be in a simulation, just like Amy did before. But now, with our crew observing the simulated crew, they know the answer to their question for certain.
I mean, what if our laws of physics are just the computer code of some big, brilliant professor playing God up there?
Nailed it.
So for the simulated characters, in order to figure out if they're living in a simulation, they decide to force the collapse of a magnetic star, something so complex that the computer won't be able to properly simulate it without glitching out, which the non-simulated professor realizes will, without question, show them that they are in a simulation. And Bender's existential empathy overload leads him to want to be the one to tell his computerized compatriots that they aren't real. He wants to be there for them in that really difficult time. The professor hooks him into the simulation, but before Bender can tell everyone, Fry's impassioned speech about what they mean to each other brings Bender peace.
It doesn't matter if I'm real?
So what did you want to tell us, Robert?
Just thank you.
So as they force the magnetar to collapse and the system overloads, Bender somehow reboots back in the real world and reveals that the professor can simply underclock the computer, leading it to run the simulation so slowly that the magnetar won't collapse for centuries, leading to the absolutely beautiful final sequence as the simulation glitches out and Fry and Leela slowly move to embrace each other. Okay, I know that was a lot of recap for the last few paragraphs, but this is all important for some major analysis here. There are two things I really want to talk about with this episode. One about the lore of the show that is subtly hinted at here, and another about the metatextual meaning behind this episode. And both are really cool in my opinion. Without flat out revealing it, this episode is heavily implying that the Futurama crew we follow also live in a simulation, and it's all hinted at through Bender. The professor tells Bender that his trip into the simulation will be a one-way trip. There's no way for him to return. And yet, without explanation, Bender returns. But he doesn't actually. What's happening when Bender reawakens is that the Bender from the next universe up is going into this simulation, just like our Bender went into that simulation. He reboots and awakens the exact same way in both instances.
Where am I? Rebooting. Where am I?
In both cases, Bender asks where he is because he's jumped into a simulation he doesn't belong to, so listen carefully to what he says when he shows back up in our universe.
Oh, I had to come tell you something.
Bender is sad and wistful, not like when we last saw him inside the simulation, where he had accepted his fate and the fact that he isn't real. Like our Bender wanted to tell the simulated crew that they weren't real, this Bender came to this simulation to tell them something as well. There's no explanation for how Bender came back or how he knew how to save the simulation. It's because he's a different Bender from the next universe or next simulation up.
It's Bender's all the way down.
This idea might make some fans mad, since now the Bender we've been following is stuck in the underclocked simulation, and now we've got a different Bender, but I think the science fiction of it all makes it worth it, much like the results of the late Philip J. Fry's universe jumping. But what I want to talk about even more than this subtle Futurama lore bomb is the metatextual takeaway from this episode, or at least my metatextual takeaway. To me, it's sort of about the show Futurama itself. The way I see it, Bender's adoration and connection to the simulation of the universe is a stand-in for us as an audience and our love for Futurama. Bender has grown this immense connection to these simulated people and cannot cope with the idea of their existence coming to an end. A concept that Futurama fans are all too familiar with. We love and adore these fictional characters because even though they aren't real, there's beauty in their stories that we connect to. And I think the dialogue throughout the episode really reflects this idea.
Would it be any less beautiful if it weren't real? And we weren't real?
They, of course, aren't real. We know this, but they still have a real impact on us.
We're nothing more than atoms, right? But somehow, we are more.
And this even extends to when we dislike an episode of the show. The fact is that we care so much about this show and these fictional characters that we truly feel disappointment if the show lets us down. These moving drawings have a real, tangible effect on us, positive and negative, and that is special. Obviously, this isn't unique to Futurama, it's fiction in general, but in a way, this show is a simulation. Obviously, it's not a literal simulation, but it is an entirely fabricated world and universe. And while this latest revival wasn't necessarily one any of us expected, in the past, Futurama has been canceled prematurely, and there have been times where we as fans were all Bender in this episode, desperate for the simulation that we connected to continue its life, hoping that it doesn't end tragically. And obviously, beyond that, there's the existential message of it all. Bender is a character in particular who is constantly searching for the meaning in his existence, which has always worked great given that he's an artificial being. But this is obviously something that humans do in general, whether that's seeking answers through religion or science or philosophy. And if the answer is actually that, oh, we are literally all just in a giant simulation, ultimately, does that matter? It doesn't change anything from our perspective, because existence isn't about the answer, it's about the meaning we find within it. The answer probably isn't going to bring you peace. The connections we make are what are important to us, whether we're real or we're simulated.
But I love you, now and forever. And that much is real, even if we're not.
The more I watch this finale, the more I really, really love it. So many of Futurama's best episodes balance mind-bending sci-fi premises with impressive existential and philosophical themes, and this one really nails both. I'm not sure if it's my #1 favorite of this newest season. It might sit just behind I Know What You Did Next Xmas, but who knows, this one keeps getting better for me, so it could overtake it. This first Hulu season of Futurama definitely had its ups and downs. Going in, I was not convinced it should happen at all, and while I do still think Meanwhile was a beautiful ending for the show, we've gotten some stuff this season that I'm really, really grateful for. And after a 10-year hiatus, I feel like the writers can really start hitting their stride in the next 10 episodes. You know, the recent series finale of 2020 got me thinking about series finales. More specifically, Futurama's series finale. Even more specifically, the fact that Futurama had 4 series finales. One of the strange byproducts of Futurama's on-again, off-again relationship to our television screens was that the writing staff could never be certain if any given season would be the last. In fact, Fox never even formally canceled the series back in the early 2000s, they just didn't renew them for a 5th production cycle. Then, when the show returned in straight-to-DVD movie form, and later for 2 production cycles on Comedy Central, the fate of the show's renewal was equally ambiguous. Fortunately, the writers stayed on their toes since they did not want Futurama to end with a fizzle, and always sought to give the series some sense of closure when the production cycle would end, just in case. And this vigilance is why Futurama actually had 4 different episodes that were written and produced as possible series finales. That's right, 4 series finales. The 4 episodes in question are The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, Into the Wild Green Yonder, Overclockwise, and of course, Meanwhile, which would end up being the actual series finale. All of these episodes tackled giving the series a bit of closure in a different way, but which of them did it best? Today, let's talk about all of Futurama's series finales and determine which one is the Futurama series finale to rule them all. Alright, so when looking at these 4 series finales, in the end we're going to assess them 2 different ways. Which is the best episode and which is the best finale, because these are distinct things. So I'm going to briefly run down the premise of each ep with select commentary, and then talk about what finale elements were included. First up, The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings. The staff tasked series vet Ken Keeler to pen this finale, and the episode heavily focuses on Fry and Leela's will they won't they relationship. The episode follows up another classic, Parasites Lost, which showed Fry and Leela get together after parasitic worms actually improved Fry as a person. Specifically, this follows up how Fry learned to play the holophoner for Leela.
Remember when I had those stomach worms that made me smart? I could play the holophoner, and it made Leela like me.
When Fry shows little to no hope in holophoning, Bender suggests he metaphorically make a deal with the devil.
And by devil, I mean robot devil. And by metaphorically, I mean get your coat.
The sequence in Robot Hell is really well executed. Fry basically agrees to switch his own hands with another random robot to be decided by this giant wheel of fate. There are a ton of visual hints and cues leading the viewer to believe that the switch is going to end up being with Bender. The way the Robot Devil says,
"Probably one you've never even met,"
followed by Bender rubbing his hands together. As the wheel spins, they specifically show Bender waving his own hands around, and of course, the wheel nearly lands on Bender before jumping over the Robot Devil. It's just good visual storytelling. The Robot Devil's hands make Fry an incredible musician, and Hedonism Bot asks him to write an opera, and Fry agrees with one important term.
If I can make it about Leela.
Me? Really?
But of course, the episode wouldn't have a deal with the devil without a devious plan. First, the Robot Devil gets Bender to trade him his shiny metal ass for a big blowhorn. Next, Bender uses that blowhorn on Leela, temporarily making her deaf.
What? Are you talking?
Leela doesn't want Fry to know she can't hear his opera, trying to fake her way through the first act, but at intermission, she too ends up making a deal with the Robot Devil. She trades one of her hands for the ability to hear.
I can hear! I can hear like a safecracker!
So with Leela now able to hear Fry's opera, the Robot Devil springs his trap. He interrupts the show with a line that is used all the time in YouTube video essays, and rightfully so.
You can't just have your characters announce how they feel. That makes me feel angry!
But the big twist is all revealed as the scripted opera turns into an ad-libbed performance by all of our major players.
I agreed that I'd give him my hand.
In marriage.
So the Robot Devil tricks Leela into giving him her hand in marriage, and Fry has a decision to make, the ultimate catch-22. He can keep his hands so that he can keep playing the music that will make Leela fall in love with him, but Leela would be trapped in Robot Hell with the Robot Devil, or he can save Leela by giving up his hands and his ability to make beautiful music. Fry obviously makes the only choice he can here, and unfortunately his holophoner skills left with his hands.
Your music's bad and you should feel bad.
But the final sequence is pretty much perfect. Leela asks Fry to keep playing.
Please don't stop playing, Fry. I want to hear how it ends.
I really love this last shot. The music is beautiful. It's not particularly impressive as a composition, but it's sweet and emotional. In Fry's final performance, Fry and Leela kiss, hold hands, and walk off into the distance together. So as far as finales go, I think this does a pretty damn great job. The episode is funny and true to Futurama as a series. It has a pretty fun and out there premise with great twists and turns. I suppose the premise is maybe a little more existential than it is sci-fi, but I think Futurama has always walked that line pretty well. Fry and Leela's relationship was definitely the biggest through line in the series that didn't have much of a resolution. It's also probably the biggest emotional aspect of the series that fans were invested in up to this point. With episodes like the aforementioned Parasites Lost, Time Keeps on Slippin', and Why of Fry, all leaving us with bittersweet Fry and Leela endings. This one keeps that tradition alive, but maybe a bit on the sweeter side. If this had been the very last episode of the show, we would have been left with a very optimistic ending in regards to Fry and Leela's relationship. It left the show with the implication that Fry and Leela would one day be together, but didn't give a definitive answer in case the show was renewed. Personally, I don't mind the bittersweet ending. It leaves you with a bit more to chew on and think about than a definitive ending might. We also get to see a handful of fan favorite characters at the opera, and my personal favorite aspect, major roles for both the Robot Devil and Hedonism Bot, possibly my two favorite robots in the show. The truth is, though I desperately wanted more Futurama back when this actually was the series finale, this was a very emotionally satisfying way to end the show. It's rare that the final episode of a series is one of its best, but I think this is probably a top 5 episode. If there had never been another episode of Futurama, I would have been very pleased with this ending. But as we know, this wasn't actually the end of Futurama. The show would be revived in the form of 4 straight-to-DVD movies. These movies released from 2007 to 2009, and as with The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, the final film was written as though it could possibly be the final time we see the Futurama crew in action. This last movie was called Into the Wild Green Yonder, and they once again tasked Ken Keeler to write the script. Now this is definitely the most unique of all of Futurama's series finales, as it's an entire movie the length of 4 regular Futurama episodes. This is definitely the Futurama finale with the biggest stakes, as it all culminates in a final sequence with universal implications. Rather than break down this entire movie, I'll give you a very abridged version of the story. Basically, thanks to an explosive accident, Fry is gifted the ability to read other people's thoughts, but as the series previously established, Fry's lack of a delta brainwave prevents other people who can read minds from being able to read his mind. Because of this, a secret society of tinfoil hat-wearing madfellows tasks Fry with a very important quest. He must stop an ancient alien race known as the Dark Ones from destroying another ancient alien race known as the Encyclopods. He's the only one who can do this because the Dark Ones can read thoughts and would be aware of any plot to destroy them unless Fry is the one with that plan. At the same time, Leela has become a protester and activist that's trying to protect a violet dwarf star from being destroyed by Leo Wong. The two stories converge when Fry learns that the violet dwarf star is actually an egg containing the encyclopod he's tasked to protect, with Leela falsely believing that Fry is on Team Wong, trying to destroy the dwarf star. Basically, Fry can't risk the Dark One discovering his plan, so he can't tell Leela that he's trying to protect the violet dwarf star. Man, this story is a little bit sweaty, that's a lot of setup. But the important part about the ending is that we get a really nice moment here between Fry and Leela. Leela has been told the entire episode that she cannot trust Fry, while Fry keeps asking her to trust him. But she realizes that regardless of how bad it looks, she knows she can trust Fry's intentions.
You're you. That's all I need to know.
After a big dramatic ending involving the Encyclopods, the crew flees Zap Brannigan in the Planet Express ship. There are some really great last moments in this final scene.
There were so many things I wanted to say to you.
Like what?
Like, this is not the end, but mostly just, I love you, Leela.
And of course, Leela finally reciprocates, though it is interrupted.
I love you too. Wormhole!
But I think my favorite is that the crew, uncertain of their future, embraces the unknown.
Into the breach, meatbags.
A perfect metaphor for the state of the series at this point. And of course, Fry and Leela kiss before flying into the wormhole, triggering a graphic that mirrors the opening credits. So does this episode work as a finale? Well, it's a weird question. The movie is jam-packed. There are so many stories in here. They do give a lot of character screen time. Bender has a subplot, Leela has an important story, and of course, Fry is the main focus. The episode calls back to Fry's Delta brainwave and Fry and Leela's relationship, two important through lines for Futurama fans. But all of this stuff feels almost secondary to a lot of the stories in the movie. There's an entire episode spent on a poker tournament. Another heavily features a prison break. The second prison break in these Futurama movies, might I add. But it was nice to see them do such a variety of things with their potentially final adventure. The final sequence near the Violet Dwarf Star also jam-packs pretty much every character that's ever been in Futurama into the crowd. A nice little visual to showcase just how far the show has come. This movie also followed up the weird little waterfall family through line for the series, which some people might not even be aware of. Basically, in this movie and 3 other episodes of the show, we meet members of the Waterfall family, who are often some sort of activists. At the end of each of their episodes, they tragically die, and 2 of those times, a new family member has appeared to promise to avenge their death.
Great-grandpa, no!
The movie brought that story to a close by killing both Frida Waterfall and Hutch Waterfall and having Hutch's DNA be saved by the Encyclopod. A fun little connection for the fans who really dig the weird little pieces of continuity the series had to offer. The end of the movie also features a big climactic countdown, which was a small callback to the pilot, which also featured a couple prominent countdowns when Fry is frozen and at the end of the episode. Personally, I think the final moments are what really makes the episode work as a finale, even if they feel a bit disconnected from the rest of the movie. The final moments between Fry and Leela, the crew accepting their uncertain fate, and the book-ended blue Futurama graphic really did it for me. So even though I don't think this episode was quite as good as the previous finale, I think it offered a pretty satisfying ending. Once again uncertain, but maybe a little more certain than the last time. And once again, leaves you with something to think about. But as we know, this was not the series finale. Again.
Yeah, we're back.
The show would be revived on Comedy Central, initially for 26 episodes that would span 2 broadcast seasons. So, once again, when they reached the end of this production cycle, they wrote a potential series finale, this time called Overclockwise. And you know who wrote it? Ken Keeler, baby! This episode showed Kubert help Bender overclock his own processor and basically become a robot god. But because Kubert broke the terms of service for their bending unit, he and the professor are sued by Mom, putting Planet Express at risk of going out of business. I love their sign when they're going out of business forever again. A fun nod to the fact that this is in fact the 3rd time they'd written a series finale. Once the company is in danger, Leela decides that it's time to pack it up and move on with their life, leaving Fry without the 2 most important people to him, since Bender had sort of ascended to his new godlike form. In the end, Bender returns to save the day with a fun little twist. He convinces the prosecution to drop the charges on Kubert on account of him being a minor. But because Kubert is a clone of the professor, he too is acquitted thanks to double jeopardy.
What a brilliant legal shenanigan. Case dismissed.
At the end of the episode, Leela returns to Planet Express, and the episode gives us one of those classic pull-at-the-heartstrings endings it's known for. Before Bender underclocked himself, he made sure to keep a bunch of answers to life's many questions, including the ultimate fate of Fry and Leela. We don't get to read it, but we do get to see Fry and Leela's reaction to it. There's a range of emotions, but the last one is the most important. This episode has a lot to like and is definitely one of the better entries in the revival seasons, but the question is, was it a good series finale? Well, it had some really funny gags at Zoidberg's expense.
Quick, Zoidberg, take 3 steps to your right.
Which is pretty classic Futurama. It had a fun sci-fi premise with Bender's overclocking, which led to some really gorgeous sequences that I love to look at. The court case showed off a good mix of random characters from across Futurama's history and the jury, and it of course had that all-important Fry and Leela-centric ending. By this finale, I was pretty damn impressed that they managed to continue to give us a little bit more finality to Fry and Leela's relationship without outright giving us the answer. 3 finales in a row, they walked that line perfectly. Really impressive stuff, and the execution of this moment was honestly one of the most effective of any finale. Such a smart way to show us but not tell us that Fry and Leela are destined for each other, leaving the show open for more, but again, a satisfying ending if this was actually the end. But of course, it actually was not the end again. The show got renewed for one final production cycle at Comedy Central, so 26 episodes later, the real, actual, factual series finale aired. The episode was called Meanwhile, and I'll give you 3 guesses who wrote it. That's right, Ken motherfucking Keeler, the king of series finales. After Leela has a near-death experience at Luna Park, Fry decides that he officially cannot live without her and decides to propose. This episode also gives us another great sci-fi premise. The professor creates a button that rewinds time 10 seconds.
Couldn't you go back in time as far as you want by pressing the button over and over?
Oh, Leela. Poor Leela.
Each time the button sends you back 10 seconds, it takes 10 seconds to recharge.
Fry uses the time rewind button to get Leela a very nice engagement ring and tells her to meet him at the Vampire State Building at sundown if she accepts his proposal. When she doesn't arrive, he expects the worst and jumps off the tower, not wanting to live without Leela's love. But, classic Fry, his watch was wrong from all the time rewinding he did. As he approaches the ground, he sees Leela coming to meet him, and he presses the button in an attempt to jump back to the top of the building. Unfortunately, he had been falling for over 10 seconds and just keeps prolonging the inevitable. Thanks to some time shelter shenanigans, the professor figures out what is happening and the crew slowly makes their way to try and help Fry. But when Leela presses the button after the professor leaves the time shelter, he is, as he himself put it,
shredded across the time-space continuum like human coleslaw.
The crew manages to buffer Fry's fall and prevent another horrific death, but as Fry lands, he destroys the button, freezing the entire universe in that one single moment, except for him and Leela. The two of them end up living out their entire lives together. They have a wedding, they travel the world, and they grow old together. In the end, the professor finds his way back to Fry and Leela, and then he manages to find a way for all of them to get back to their lives.
You mean we'll all get to live our lives over again?
But there's one caveat. They won't remember what happened.
What do you say? Want to go around again?
I do.
So does Meanwhile work as a series finale? To me, the answer is emphatically yes. It gives us an absolutely top-notch sci-fi premise with this time button. In fact, the premise was so great that Rick and Morty stole it and then won an Emmy for it. An Emmy that rightfully belongs to BoJack Horseman, but that's another story. But this time, the focus on Fry and Leela's relationship was much more definitive and tugged at the heartstrings for most of the episode. In fact, I think the entire world freezing around them is kind of a perfect send-off to Futurama. For the final episode, the world of tomorrow that we know and love was frozen in place. For a few glorious minutes, we got a perfect snapshot of the world that we spent 140 episodes growing attached to. We could see what all of our favorite side characters were doing as a part of their everyday routine. We could appreciate the intricacies and details of the world this team had built. And through it all, we got an incredible, emotionally satisfying ending for Fry and Leela. One that built on the previous finales while giving us something new to appreciate. And depending on how you interpret the final sequence with the professor, you could argue that by going back, these characters we know and love are going to continue to experience the entirety of this incredible series over and over again. A beautiful end to a beautiful series. So which series finale was the best series finale? Well, I think if you're asking me which of the 4 series finales is my favorite episode, the answer is The Devil's Hands or Idle Playthings. That's just genuinely one of my favorite stories ever told in Futurama, finale or not. But if you're asking me which episode is the best series finale, the answer is Meanwhile, our true finale. For all the reasons I listed previously, it just works too perfectly as a true send-off to the show. I think it helps that the crew fully expected it to truly be their last episode, whereas they always had hope for a renewal with the other finales. Into the Wild Green Yonder has a satisfying ending, but overall the movie is a bit overstuffed, and things that make it a great finale feel disconnected from the rest of the plot. Overclockwise has a similar issue. It gives us that beautiful Fry and Leela ending, but it also doesn't feel particularly tied to the story of the rest of the episode. Plus, it didn't really sit right with me that the series finale would sideline Leela like that. She was gone from the story for a huge chunk of the episode. And while Devil's Hands might be my favorite episode of the bunch, it doesn't celebrate Futurama as a series quite like Meanwhile does. Okay, this is kinda morbid, but I also noticed that in Into the Wild Green Yonder, Fry is willing to sacrifice himself thinking he's the Dark One. In Overclockwise, he willingly floats over Niagara Falls, and in Meanwhile, he jumps off the Vampire State Building. Dude nearly kills himself in 3 of 4 finales. For a series finale, this seems like an extra risky strategy.
Did you say extra crispy recipe?
So if I were to rank them in terms of episode quality, it goes 4 Into the Wild Green Yonder, 3 Overclockwise, 2 Meanwhile, and 1 The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings. But my ranking in terms of how well they function as a series finale, it goes 4 Overclockwise, 3 Into the Wild Green Yonder, 2 The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, and number 1 Meanwhile. I gotta say, series finales can be hard. There are tons of hugely popular series out there that did not deliver satisfying endings for their audience, and many that are well received still don't quite satisfy their entire fan base. Some shows don't even get to properly end their show, but I don't think I've heard of a single person who doesn't love Meanwhile. It's just everything you can want and more out of a series finale. For a lot of Futurama fans, the revival seasons were a bit uneven, and the consistency we were used to for so many years seemed to wane. But to be rewarded with a finale of this caliber is genuinely one of the most satisfying things I've ever experienced in fandom. In fact, my very first Futurama video last year was a video about the late Philip J. Fry that I titled Futurama's Final Masterpiece. I might have to rescind that title because after rewatching Meanwhile, I think I have to admit that Futurama's swan song was in fact their true final masterpiece.
I can't believe it's happening again, but with the release of Futurama's Otherwise, we have now hit the 5th episode in the show's history that was written as a potential series finale. We also, of course, are going in knowing that it isn't the series finale, with 20 more episodes on the way over the next couple of years, but the Futurama writing staff always hedges their bets, and so we do know that this one could have been the end. It was written just in case. But how did it compare to the previous 4 potential series finales? Would this have been a satisfying ending? Honestly, it feels like a little bit of deja vu asking all these questions.
Deja vu? I feel like I've heard of that before. No, wait, I'm thinking of De La Soul.
Okay, so first off, I do think it's kind of important to note that because we know there are 20 more episodes coming in the future, and that this episode isn't going to be the series finale, it takes a bit of pressure off of it. I'm now going in not needing this to absolutely blow the roof off in terms of a finale episode, because we know there will be at least one more shot in a couple of years. But even with that in mind, there is definitely higher expectations when it comes to these episodes. Once again, Ken Keeler takes a crack at this finale script after having written all 4 previous attempts: The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, Into the Wild Green Yonder, Overclockwise, and of course Meanwhile, which stood as the actual finale for 10 years. I actually made a pretty detailed video about the 4 previous finales like 3.5 years ago, obviously before we knew the show would be returning, so maybe I'll update it when we hit that final series finale, whenever that happens. So how does it stand up? Well, I think Otherwise is a really strong episode, and it does a lot of things I really love as a potential series finale. However, I do not think it surpasses or even quite lives up to the previous series finale, Meanwhile. And honestly, that's okay. But I do think Otherwise is probably stronger than some of the other finale attempts like Into the Wild Green Yonder or Overclockwise, placing it pretty firmly in the middle of my ranking. Typically, these finales will start with a title caption that references that this might be a series finale, this one claiming we're not out of networks yet, and right off the bat, they bring in one of the funnier but smaller aspects of the show's history, Bender's sort of ongoing feud with the can opener. Bender was nearly killed by this thing first, and I second that emotion.
Stupid can opener! You killed my father, and now you've come back for me!
This obviously also states that the can opener murdered Bender's father as well, though this isn't referenced at all in Otherwise. Might have been a nice touch if they had referenced this, but that's okay. And then we also see Bender actually get paralyzed by the can opener in Bendin' in the Wind, so this is an ongoing thing between the two of them. And it also makes a point to reference that Bender sings folk songs when he's magnetized.
Down in the valley!
The The folk singing magnet joke was established in the second episode of the entire show, The Series Has Landed, which was also written by Ken Keeler. So pretty immediately, they are paying homage to things that have taken place across Futurama's history, all the way back to the very first season, which is a nice start. But I think what really works in this one is that they sort of treat the Planet Express ship as a surrogate for the show itself. And with the ship being destroyed, they hold a funeral and eulogize the ship, which is very clearly a way for them to eulogize the show. In classic Futurama fashion, it hits emotionally and comedically.
She saw us through lots of great adventures.
And a few mediocre ones.
Honestly, some of those 3-part adventures were kind of sloppy.
I'm not sure if when they say 3-part adventures, they're referring to the anthology episodes or the movies, but either way, I think the self-deprecating jab here is pretty fitting. There are definitely some sloppy anthologies, and a couple of those movies aren't very cohesive. The funeral allows for this really sweet sequence where the crew walks around the ship one last time to say goodbye. Christopher Ting's score here really helps with the somber mood. All around, this worked great for me, but the sci-fi aspect of this episode centers on this ship graveyard, or as the professor refers to it, the plasma sea at the bottom of the multiverse, which contains jet streams of alternate realities. Obviously, with the rise of Rick and Morty and other more popular modern media, multiverses are really trendy right now. However, Futurama was dabbling in multiverses all the way back in the Farnsworth Paradox in the original Fox run, and I think the way they're used in this finale is super effective. While paying respects to the ship, Fry starts to become overloaded with memories, even ones that haven't actually happened to him. And rather than explore a ton of alternate dimensions, they sort of play on how Fry's untethered memories motivate and change his behavior. It isn't explained explicitly in the episode, but I like to assume that the reason Fry is able to tap into all of these alternate memories over the plasma sea is probably due to his lack of a delta brainwave. But these memories are fascinating, and I think obviously the biggest takeaway from the episode for most people is going to be one of these specific images, if they caught it. We'll cover that last. But there's actually a lot of other stuff to dive into, and they get pretty creative with these alternate memories. The idea is that not all of these memories actually happened to our version of Fry. In this 10-second sequence, there are 37 shots. Most of them are just old adventures from the show's history, and I won't go over every single one. But it is worth noting that a handful of these shots were actually reanimated versions of older episodes, but most importantly, a select few of them are alternate realities. The second shot we see is the classic ending of Time Keeps on Slippin'. However, in this alternate universe, you can actually see that Leela is only spelled with one E for some reason. The fifth shot of the montage is actually the one that became the iconic "not sure if" Fry meme from The Lesser of Two Evils. However, in this version, Fry has no eyes and also features the color palette seen from the alternate Fry that we meet in the Farnsworth Paradox. The no eyes bit is actually also a reference to one of the other universes in the Farnsworth Paradox.
We didn't see anything. Ever.
However, we know this has to be a separate eyeless alternate universe because Fry's color palette is different. The seventh shot in this montage shows the shot from the bird bot of Icecatraz when Bender and Fry are arguing after Bender becomes the captain of the ship. Once again, this features the Parabox alternate color palette Fry. However, we know it can't be the universe we visited in the Farnsworth Paradox either, because in that universe, Bender is gold. So this is just firmly establishing that there are multiple realities where Fry has the black hair, green jacket color palette, and we immediately see this color palette again in the eighth shot, once again showcasing the iconic Fry squinty eye meme, but with the palette swapped Fry instead this time. This one theoretically could be in the Parabox universe that we visited, but hard to say. Next, we see Bobblehead Fry, who is also seen in the Farnsworth Parabox. This actually looks like it was the same shot and location reanimated from that episode, but only drawing Fry, not Leela and Bender's versions of themselves, and also giving Fry changing expressions, which didn't happen in the original episode. And then the 11th shot in this quick flash montage is the one everyone will be talking about if they caught it, which is of course the shot of older Fry and Leela with a purple-haired baby boy. And also Bender with ears holding Seymour, or at least a dog that looks like Seymour. We have seen Bender with ears before. He put them on in Godfellas so that he could put in earplugs to try and get some sleep, and then in Murder on the Planet Express, the shape-shifting alien accidentally kept human ears when pretending to be Bender. But I think the idea here is really just that this is an alternate Bender. Obviously, this could be seen as a huge tease for Fry Fry and Leela's future, but with Bender having ears, I do think this is meant to hint that it isn't strictly the future for our Fry and Leela, but more so a possible outcome. Futurama has dabbled in utilizing Fry and Leela's future son before. In the 32nd issue of the comic book series, they meet Leland, which is a nightmarish combination of Fry, Leela, and Bender, who ends up being this future dictator. Really brief appearance, but this is the first time they ever explored this. Then also in the Comedy Central era, the episode Law and Oracle was actually originally meant to be an episode about a backwards time traveler who basically moved literally backwards in time, Tenet style, with the end of the episode intending to reveal that the character was Fry and Leela's son. The episode obviously shifted significantly and this never happened, though it's an idea I always wanted them to revisit. But honestly, now with such an explicit Fry and Leela child tease in the body of the show, I really hope that this is explored more in the coming 2 seasons, or maybe once again in the next series finale. It is very much just a blink and you'll miss it tease here, and it isn't really touched on further in the episode, but it feels like something that they should explore moving forward. And though the rest of this flashy memory montage is all moments from the show without any real changes, there are a couple that are kind of fascinating to consider. One of the memories we see is the simulated pixel versions of Fry and Leela from last year's season finale all the way down. So my question is, did Fry remember watching this moment of his simulated counterpart, or does he actually also have the simulation's memories flowing through him? Similarly interesting, we see a shot from the Sting that was confirmed to be a part of Leela's coma dream, which is obviously not a memory that our Fry could conceivably have. And lastly, there's a shot of Fry and Leelu from Bender's Big Score, but that version of Fry was actually Lars, so he also seemingly has memories from his time paradox duplicate. I don't have any real theories as to what this all means, but I do think all of this is really fascinating to consider. But this is where the episode takes its big turn. Fry passes out from the memory overload, and the crew goes back into the ship to rescue him just before the ship is detonated and falls into the plasma sea. And when we return from commercial break, inexplicably, Fry has been rescued and everybody is okay. And I really loved Fry's description of his mental breakdown here.
I had some kind of attack. I started seeing flashes of things that happened, also things that didn't happen, except it felt like they did happen. Or will happen.
And this basically drives the rest of the episode. Fry is sort of haunted by these memories of things that feel real but he didn't actually experience, and for the second series finale in a row, a traumatic event leads Fry to want to propose to Leela.
So tonight at sunset, I'm meeting Leela on top of the Vampire State Building. I'm gonna ask her to marry me.
And this is where the deja vu comes in, because if that sounds familiar, it's exactly the plan he had in Meanwhile for his first proposal, an event that was wiped from his and Leela's memory because of the end of that episode, as well as the beginning of the Impossible Stream. But this time, it's playing on the fact that this is all happening again.
What's the matter?
Nothing, I just felt strange, like we'd had champagne here before.
And this all leads more explicitly to Fry having another vision overload, but this time of the events of Meanwhile. And I'm of two minds about this idea. On one hand, I love the way they're sort of collapsing all of these stories in on themselves. With those events having been wiped from their memory, the fact that they are still affecting the characters somehow makes it feel like it has this lasting impact, instead of just being a thing that only the audience saw and knows about. But on the other hand, while I think this is a great episode, it does sort of feel like the story itself is kind of explicitly chasing the success of Meanwhile by referencing it so overtly. I think if this had been the actual series finale, I would have maybe felt that this was a slightly unsatisfactory ending for that reason. However, I also think with the reveal at the end of the episode, it makes it sort of beautiful in a different way, which I'll get to later. Fry's phantom memories mostly lead to him wondering if he's even sane or if he's entirely losing his mind, and honestly what I love most about this aspect of the story is the simple fact that Leela confidently stands by him despite all of this insanity that he's going through.
And all I ever wanted to do is marry you. But first, I need to understand what's happening to me.
I'm not going anywhere.
The last act is primarily about the crew testing out their brand new ship, which is actually a design I really dig, but it also follows this ghost ships plot, the highlight of which is the reverb they throw on the words
Ghost ships.
Basically, there are rumors and sightings of these mysterious ghost ships, and Fry seems to think that one of them is the old Planet Express ship. I also really loved the professor having not one but two references to a pilot episode joke.
You should see the wire I used. all the latest lengths.
These kinds of bookend jokes are, in my opinion, a really nice touch when doing these series finales. Nothing too overt, but just a nice callback from the end to the very beginning. The entire Bender is jealous of the can opener plotline also has some really fun moments, but if I had any criticism of this episode as a whole, it's that it didn't really tie into the climax in any meaningful way. It was nice to have a funny Bender subplot for the finale. The moment when he just straight up shoots the can opener is hysterical.
You think they'll try me as an adult?
But it really didn't lead to much else, and I wasn't really overly fond of the whole Bender one-hand joke. However, while Meanwhile was such a great series finale back in 2013, that episode did have a real lack of focus on any characters outside of Fry and Leela, and with Bender being such a big part of the show, I do think it's totally valid to want to make sure he gets some time to shine in a possible finale, which all culminates in what I think is a mostly pretty effective ending. The crew, as well as the Nimbus, get into a firefight with a ghost ship over the Plasma Sea, with all signs pointing towards their certain doom.
I guess this is the end again.
I don't mind dying, as long as it's with you.
I really love this line, and the fact that Fry really just laments that he and Leela never got married, which of course leads Leela to asking Zap if he'll marry them before the end, since he's a captain. And in this beautiful moment, the pair kiss, newly married, just before the ship is destroyed. And then of course we get the reveal that for this entire episode, we were actually following an alternate Fry and Leela, and that the ghost ship they were fighting was our crew on the original Planet Express ship in their proper reality. I really enjoyed this reveal, though I do think that maybe the quick exposition dump was a tiny bit clumsy, though I don't really have an alternate pitch for how they could have executed it. It just kind of required a little bit of over-explanation as to what was going on. This scene also showcases another interesting revelation. The professor points out that out of the ship in this sequence, they were seeing numerous alternate realities and possibilities. While there were some new things showcased, like everyone worshipping a King Bender, and also the entire crew in coffins, which is maybe a reference to the fact that the show has been so close to death so many times, they also showcased scenes from some of the anthology episodes in alternate animation styles, specifically the old Disney-style animation from Reincarnation, as well as the G.I. Joe-style animation from Saturday Morning Fun Pit, basically meaning that even those anthology stories are technically canon by ways of the multiverse. They also showcased Dreamland Castle for yet another Disenchantment reference, and while the whole alternate reality aspect of this is fun to talk about, what I liked most about it was the idea that the entire crew came together and patched the ship back up to get it running again. Sort of an allusion to the crew of the show returning after so many years to rebuild it. I could see some people finding the fact that a lot of this story was following a different Fry and Leela to be a little unsatisfactory, but here's why this works so well for me. Though we followed an alternate Fry and Leela for most of the episode, that Fry's actions were motivated by the memories of our Fry and Leela. The unrealized events of Meanwhile, in particular, were driving even these other versions of the characters we know and love. I think it's really nice that even across universes, somehow, these two will always find one another, even if it is just moments from their demise. One thing I've talked a lot about with my good friend Toonrific Tariq about these Futurama finales is that the best ones tend to have these great final lines. Lines that sort of have a feeling of finality while also hinting at the possibility of what's to come for the characters. The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings nailed this the first go-around.
Please don't stop playing, Fry. I want to hear how it ends.
And then, I think Meanwhile also delivered a comparably great final line in that same vein.
What do you say? Want to go around again?
I do.
And I think Otherwise also kinda nails it in this regard. Fry draws out one of his phantom memories for Leela, which is a moment from Meanwhile, which is a nice confirmation that our Fry and Leela now have at least some recollection of those events. And then they say this.
What does it mean?
I don't know. Let's find out.
The episode ends with a cover of Warren Zevon's song Mutineer, performed by Jason Isbell and Amanda Shires, which is almost a cheat code. I find the song so emotional it makes me tear up pretty instantly. However, they actually start playing the song on the second verse instead of the first, and I think these lyrics are pretty intentionally highlighted. I was born to rock the boat, some may sink, but we will float. And given the events of this episode, I think that this kinda perfectly describes Fry. His entire existence is sort of this anomaly thanks to his lack of a delta brainwave. He's been tasked with saving the universe because of it on multiple occasions. He was born to rock the boat, one could say. And in some realities, that boat rocking works out, and in others, it ends in beautiful tragedy. Like the Fry and Leela we followed through a lot of this episode. Some may sink, but we will float. Guys, I think this was a really valiant effort as another series finale. I do not think it's as strong as Devil's Hands or Meanwhile, but I think it's stronger than Overclockwise or Into the Wild Green Yonder, and it's definitely one of the best episodes of the Hulu era. And in about 2 years, they're going to get at least one more chance to end the series on a high note. And I guess the question is, do we think they can do it?
I don't know. Let's find out.